Welcome. As the day's light begins to fade and the quiet of the evening deepens around you, we invite you to settle into a space of comfort and stillness. This is a moment to release any lingering tensions, to soften your gaze, and to allow your body to gently relax into its resting place. Take a slow, deep breath, and as you exhale, feel a sense of calm begin to spread through you. Tonight, we embark on a journey through time, a contemplative exploration of a life that shaped an era. Our destination is the distant past, the late 18th and early 19th centuries, where the intricate tapestry of European history was profoundly influenced by one singular figure, Napoleon Bonaparte. We will trace his path from humble beginnings to the pinnacle of power and through the dramatic shifts of his destiny. This narrative is crafted to be a quiet companion as you drift towards slumber. There will be no urgency, no sharp turns, but rather a steady, measured unfolding of historical events. Allow the gentle rhythm of the story to guide your thoughts away from the present and into a serene contemplation of history. Each word is intended to soothe, each detail to quietly inform as your mind prepares for a night of restorative rest. Let the sound of the narrative be a soft anchor, drawing you deeper into a state of peace. Simply listen and allow the story to carry you. Our journey into the life of Napoleon Bonaparte begins not on the grand stages of Europe, but on a rugged, sun-drenched island in the Mediterranean Sea, Corsica. Imagine this land, far from the bustling capitals, an ancient place sculpted by wind and sea, and its mountains rise sharply from the coastline covered in dense maquis, a fragrant scrubland of myrtle, heather, and wild herbs. The air itself seems to carry the scent of the earth and the distant salt spray. Corsica, in the latter half of the 18th century, was a place of wild beauty and fiercely independent spirit. It had a history steeped in struggle, having been passed between various powers for centuries. When Napoleon was born in August of 1769, the island had only recently come under French control, having been sold by Genoa to France the previous year. This transition was not entirely peaceful. A strong sense of Corsican nationalism persisted, a quiet defiance against external rule. Life on Corsica was often defined by its isolation. Communications with the mainland were slow and infrequent. The rhythms of daily existence were closely tied to the cycles of nature, and the traditions of its people ran deep. Family clans held significant sway, and a strong sense of honour permeated the culture. This environment, distinct and somewhat removed from the Enlightenment ideals then stirring across continental Europe, would be the crucible in which Napoleon's earliest perceptions of the world were formed. It was a place where independence was valued, and where the echoes of ancient conflicts still resonated in the quiet valleys and along the rugged shorelines. This distinct heritage would subtly inform the character of the boy who would one day command armies and empires. Within this Corsican landscape in the small coastal town of Ajaccio, a significant event quietly unfolded. On August 15th, 1769, a child was born who would eventually leave an indelible mark upon the world. His name, given in the Italian tradition of his family, was Napoleon di Bonaparte. The hour of his birth, a summer's day, passed without any grand portents, simply another life beginning in a world yet unaware of the destiny that awaited him. His family, the Bonapartes, were part of the minor Corsican nobility, tracing their lineage back to Italian roots in Tuscany. They were not among the wealthiest or most powerful families on the island, but they possessed a certain standing, a connection to the island's historical fabric. His father, Carlo Maria di Buonaparte, was a lawyer and a landholder, navigating the complex political shifts of Corsica with a pragmatic approach. His mother, Maria Letizia Ramolino, Isis was a woman of strong will and considerable resilience, qualities that would certainly be inherited by her son. The home where Napoleon entered the world was a modest one for a family of their social standing, typical of the island's architecture. The sounds and sights of Ajaccio, with its harbour, its markets, and the distant murmur of the sea, would have been the earliest sensory impressions of the infant. He was the fourth of what would eventually be 8 surviving children, growing up within the lively, sometimes boisterous confines of a large family. At this moment of his birth, the name Napoleone di Bonaparte carried no particular resonance beyond the shores of Corsica. It was simply the name of a new child in a family with ancient Italian origins, a family adapting to the recent French annexation of their beloved island. The boy would carry this name and these roots as he eventually stepped beyond the quiet confines of Ajaccio, towards a future that would reshape maps and alter the course of history itself. The Bonaparte family, though part of the minor nobility on Corsica, did not possess vast wealth or extensive lands. Their noble status was more a matter of ancient lineage and local recognition than of significant material prosperity. In the intricate social tapestry of Corsica, they occupied a respectable, yet not preeminent, position. This distinction between inherited title and actual fortune would subtly influence the ambitions of the young Napoleon. At the head of this household was Carlo Maria di Buonaparte, a man of education and aspiration. He had studied law in Pisa and was well versed in the political currents of his time. Carlo possessed a certain charm and an adaptable nature, which he employed in navigating the shifting allegiances on the island, particularly after the French annexation. He served as an assessor for the royal court in Ajaccio and was eventually elected as a representative of the Corsican nobility to the court of Louis XVI in France. His endeavours were often aimed at improving the family's standing and securing a more prosperous future for his many children. His wife, Maria Letizia Ramolino, was a woman of remarkable strength and practicality. She came from a family of similar social standing, also with Genoese roots. Letizia was known for her beauty, her formidable discipline, and her unwavering devotion to her family. In an era where infant mortality was tragically common, she successfully raised 8 children to adulthood, a testament to her resilience and meticulous management of the household. Her strict yet loving upbringing instilled in her children, particularly Napoleon, a strong sense of duty and an enduring attachment to family loyalty. Together, Carlo and Letizia created a bustling home, filled with the energy of their numerous offspring. Following Napoleone came Joseph, then Lucien, Elisa, Louis, Paulina, Caroline, and Jérôme. Each child, in their own way, would be shaped by the unique environment of the Bonaparte household and the collective aspirations of their parents. The family's circumstances, poised between minor nobility and the constant need for financial improvement, fostered a dynamic where ambition was not merely tolerated but actively encouraged. This environment, where personal initiative was valued, here would prove fertile ground for the extraordinary drive that would define Napoleon's later life. The island of Corsica, where Napoleon spent his earliest years, possessed a distinct and fiercely independent spirit. For centuries, it had been under the nominal rule of the Republic of Genoa, a distant power that largely neglected the island's internal affairs. This long period of autonomy allowed a unique Corsican culture to flourish, characterized by strong family loyalties, a rugged self-reliance, and a deep distrust of external authority. The Corsican language, a dialect of Italian, was spoken throughout the island, and its traditions and customs held sway over daily life. However, this period of relative independence came to an abrupt end in 1768, just a year before Napoleon's birth. Genoa, unable to quell persistent Corsican rebellions, sold its rights to the island to France. The French, under Louis XV, then embarked on a military campaign to subdue the islanders, culminating in the Battle of Ponte Novo, where Corsican nationalist forces were decisively defeated. This marked a profound shift, transforming Corsica from a semi-autonomous territory into a department of France. For the Bonaparte family, this transition was more than just a political event. It deeply affected their identity and allegiances. Carlo Bonaparte, Napoleon's father, had initially been a supporter and close associate of Pasquale Paoli, the revered leader of the Corsican independence movement. Paoli had championed Corsican self-governance and had even drafted a democratic constitution for the island. Carlo's involvement in this nationalist cause meant that the family harboured a strong sense of Corsican identity, one that often viewed the new French rulers with suspicion and resentment. Young Napoleon grew up immersed in this atmosphere. He spoke Corsican as his first language and was surrounded by tales of Corsican heroes and the struggle against foreign domination. This early exposure to a distinct national identity, separate from and often in opposition to that of France, would leave an indelible mark. It fostered in him a sense of being an outsider, even as he later sought to integrate into French society. His initial loyalties were unequivocally Corsican, shaping his early worldview and instilling a deep appreciation for self-determination and the power of a collective will. The year 1778 marked a significant turning point in the young life of Napoleon di Bonaparte. At the tender age of 9, he was sent away from his beloved Corsica, a place that had shaped his very being, to begin his formal education in France. This journey was orchestrated by his ambitious father, Carlo, who understood that opportunities for advancement lay not on their rugged island, but within the established structures of the French mainland. It was a separation that would prove both challenging and transformative. Napoleone, accompanied by his elder brother Joseph, first arrived at the College of Autun in January 1779. This initial experience was intended to immerse them in French culture and language, preparing them for more specialised military schools. For a boy who had only ever known the distinct customs and tongue of Corsica, this transition was undoubtedly jarring. The vibrant, boisterous world of the French school, with its unfamiliar routines and social hierarchies, must have felt profoundly alien. The most immediate and significant hurdle was the language. Napoleone spoke Corsican and Italian fluently, but his French was rudimentary at best, marked by a thick accent that immediately set him apart. This linguistic barrier contributed to a sense of isolation and often made him the target of teasing from his French classmates. He struggled to express himself, a frustration that likely fueled his already fiery temperament. Learning French became an urgent necessity, a key to unlocking understanding and acceptance in this new environment. Beyond the language, the entire cultural landscape was different. The French mainland, with its more refined manners, its established social codes, and its grander scale, contrasted sharply with the more rustic, independent spirit of Corsica. Napoleone, who had been raised with a strong sense of his Corsican identity and a quiet defiance of foreign rule, now found himself squarely within the heart of that perceived foreign power. This experience of being an outsider, often feeling misunderstood and sometimes scorned, instilled in him a resilient determination. He learned to observe, to adapt, and to strive for excellence as a means of overcoming these initial disadvantages. His time in Autumn, though brief, laid the groundwork for his eventual mastery of the French language and a deeper, if sometimes reluctant, understanding of the French psyche. Following his brief stay at Autumn, young Napoleon was transferred to the Royal Military School of Brienne-le-Château in May 1779. This institution was one of a dozen such schools across France, designed to educate the sons of the nobility for careers in the military. Here he would spend over 5 years, a formative period that further solidified his character and intellectual leanings. At Brienne, Napoleon quickly distinguished himself through his academic prowess, particularly in subjects that required keen analytical thought. Mathematics proved to be his greatest strength. He excelled in geometry, algebra, and trigonometry, mastering complex concepts with an ease that often surpassed his peers. This aptitude for numbers would later prove invaluable in his military career, where precise calculations and strategic planning were paramount. Beyond mathematics, he developed a deep and abiding passion for history. He devoured texts on ancient civilizations, studying the campaigns of great commanders like Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Julius Caesar. Their strategies, their leadership, and their triumphs captivated his imagination, providing him with a rich tapestry of examples from which to draw inspiration. He also immersed himself in the works of Plutarch, absorbing the narratives of famous lives that spoke of ambition, glory, and destiny. Despite his intellectual achievements, Napoleon remained something of an outsider at Brienne. His Corsican origins and his still developing French accent continued to set him apart. He was not wealthy, and his family's minor noble status often placed him below the sons of the more established French aristocracy. This social distance, coupled with his serious and often reserved demeanour, fostered a solitary nature. He preferred the company of books to the boisterous games of his classmates, often retreating into his own thoughts, sketching battle plans, or reading in quiet corners of the school grounds. Yet, even in his solitude, early signs of his immense ambition began to emerge. He displayed a fierce pride and a competitive spirit, refusing to be overshadowed by those who might have looked down upon him. He channeled his energies into his studies, understanding that knowledge and skill were his most potent weapons in a world that often seemed intent on reminding him of his foreignness. This period at Brienne solidified his identity as a brilliant but solitary figure, already quietly charting a course for his own extraordinary future. In October of 1784, a significant transition occurred in the young life of Napoleon. Due to his exceptional performance at Brienne, particularly in mathematics, he was granted entry to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, the Royal Military Academy. This was a remarkable achievement, as only the most promising students were selected for this elite institution, which stood as the pinnacle of military education in France. His time in Paris, however, was brief, lasting less than a year. The sudden death of his father, Carlo Bonaparte, in February 1785, necessitated a swift completion of his studies. Napoleon, ever pragmatic and keenly aware of his family's financial constraints, pushed for an accelerated graduation. He completed the 2-year course in just 1 year, a testament to his intelligence and formidable work ethic. But during his tenure at the École Militaire, Napoleon made a deliberate and fateful choice regarding his military specialization. He opted for artillery. This decision was not made lightly. Artillery was considered a highly technical and intellectual branch of the army, demanding a strong grasp of mathematics, physics, and engineering. It was also a field that offered significant opportunities for tactical innovation and direct impact on the battlefield. Unlike the glamorous cavalry or the traditional infantry, artillery required strategic thinking and precise calculations to be truly effective. He immersed himself in the study of ballistics, siege warfare, and the deployment of cannon. The geometry of trajectories, the physics of recoil, and the logistical challenges of moving heavy guns across varied terrain all absorbed his attention. He understood that the power of artillery, when wielded effectively, could be a decisive factor in battle, capable of breaking enemy lines and demoralizing opposing forces. This early specialization would prove to be a cornerstone of his future military genius, allowing him to revolutionize battlefield tactics through the innovative use of massed artillery. Throughout this period, Napoleon maintained his quiet intensity. He was not known for his social graces or for cultivating friendships among his aristocratic peers. Instead, he remained focused, driven, and absorbed in his studies. His ambition, once a quiet flicker at Brienne, now burned with a steady, determined flame. He was preparing himself meticulously and relentlessly for a future he perhaps could not yet fully envision, but for which he instinctively felt destined. His time at the École Militaire, though short, provided him with the specialized knowledge and foundational understanding that would soon propel him onto the grand stage of European history. In September of 1785, at the remarkably young age of 16, Napoleon de Bonaparte received his commission as a second lieutenant in the artillery. His first posting was to the La Fère regiment stationed in Valence, a quiet town in southeastern France. This marked the official beginning of his military career, a path he had meticulously chosen and diligently prepared for. Life as a young artillery officer in peacetime was largely routine. His duties involved supervising drills, maintaining equipment, and overseeing the training of the rank and file. It was a period of practical application of the theoretical knowledge he had acquired during his intense schooling. He learned the intricacies of artillery deployment, the logistics of ammunition supply, and the crucial importance of discipline and precision in handling heavy ordnance. The rhythm of military life, with its structured days and clear hierarchy, provided a stable framework for his continued development. Despite the often mundane nature of his duties, Napoleon did not allow his intellectual curiosity to wane. He continued his relentless pursuit of knowledge through extensive reading and self-study. His meagre officer's pay was often spent on books, which became his constant companions. He devoured works on history, geography, philosophy, and military strategy. Authors like Plutarch, Rousseau, Voltaire, and the Abbé Raynal filled his quiet hours. He studied ancient campaigns, analysed the tactics of great commanders, and pondered the principles of government and human nature. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind constantly engaged, filled with observations, reflections, and ambitious plans. He practiced his writing, honing his argumentative skills and clarity of thought. This period of intense self-education was not merely a pastime. It was a deliberate and systematic effort to broaden his understanding of the world and to prepare himself for opportunities he instinctively felt would arise. He was not content with the conventional path of a junior officer. He sought to master every aspect of his profession and to comprehend the forces that shaped societies and led to conflict. His early postings, including a later transfer to Auxonne, further solidified his practical understanding of military engineering and the art of command. This quiet period of observation and profound intellectual engagement, far from the dramatic events that would soon engulf France, was a crucial crucible in which the foundations of his strategic genius were forged. He was a young officer, waiting, learning, and preparing in the quiet corners of provincial France as the storm clouds of revolution slowly gathered on the horizon. As the late 1780s unfolded across France, a profound sense of unease began to stir beneath the surface of daily life. The tranquility of provincial garrisons, where young officers like Napoleon refined their craft, belied the growing tension and discontent that permeated the kingdom. The grand structures of the Ancien Régime, with its absolute monarchy and entrenched social hierarchies, were showing increasing signs of strain. Economic hardship was a pervasive reality for many. A series of poor harvests had driven up the price of bread, the staple food for the majority of the population, pushing countless families to the brink of destitution. The royal treasury, burdened by costly wars and extravagant court spending, was nearing bankruptcy. attempts at financial reform were met with resistance from privileged nobles and clergy who clung to their ancient tax exemptions. This created a stark contrast between the opulent lives of the aristocracy and the daily struggles of the common people. Beyond the immediate material concerns, a powerful intellectual ferment was at play. The ideas of the Enlightenment, championed by thinkers like Rousseau and Voltaire, had deeply permeated French society. Concepts of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty were discussed in salons, coffee houses, and increasingly among the educated classes. These ideas challenged the divine right of kings and the legitimacy of inherited privilege, sowing seeds of doubt about the very foundations of the existing order. These converging pressures, economic distress, governmental paralysis, and revolutionary intellectual currents, created a volatile atmosphere. There was a palpable sense of anticipation, a quiet understanding that the old ways could not endure indefinitely. The air was thick with whispers of change, of a coming transformation that few could precisely define, but many felt was inevitable. While Napoleon continued his studies and military duties, travelling between various postings, he was not immune to these currents. He read the pamphlets and newspapers of the day, engaging with the evolving political discourse. The discontent he observed, the perceived injustices, and the intellectual arguments for reform undoubtedly resonated with his own experiences as an outsider and his deep-seated sense of ambition. The stage was slowly being set, not just for a revolution, but for the emergence of figures who would shape its course. France stood on the precipice, poised for a monumental shift, the scale of which would soon astonish the world. The societal structure of pre-revolutionary France was a complex tapestry, woven over centuries, yet increasingly frayed and ill-suited to the demands of a changing world. At its apex stood the absolute monarchy, personified by King Louis XVI, whose authority was theoretically derived from divine right. This meant that the king was seen as God's chosen representative on earth, accountable to no earthly power and possessing ultimate control over all aspects of government and law. Yet, in practice, this absolute power often translated into indecision and an inability to respond effectively to the mounting crises facing the nation. Beneath the monarch lay a rigid social hierarchy, traditionally divided into three estates. The first estate comprised the clergy, a powerful and wealthy group that owned significant landholdings and was largely exempt from taxation. They held immense moral and intellectual sway over the population. The second estate consisted of the nobility, a diverse class ranging from landowning aristocrats with ancient titles to recently ennobled families. They, just too, enjoyed extensive privileges, including exemption from many taxes, exclusive rights to hunting, and preferential treatment under the law. Their positions in the military, government, and church were often hereditary or purchased, creating a closed system of power. The vast majority of the population, perhaps 97 or 98%, belonged to the third estate. This was a heterogeneous group that encompassed everyone from the wealthiest merchants and lawyers, known as the bourgeoisie, to urban artisans, labourers, and the vast peasantry who toiled in the fields. Despite their immense diversity in economic contributions, the members of the Third Estate bore the brunt of taxation and had virtually no political representation. They were subject to a myriad of feudal dues, tithes to the church, and various indirect taxes that disproportionately affected the poor. The grievances of the Third Estate were manifold and deeply felt. The bourgeoisie, though often prosperous, resented their exclusion from positions of power and the privileges enjoyed by the nobility. The urban poor struggled with rising food prices and unemployment, their lives marked by insecurity and hardship. The peasants, who made up the largest segment, felt the weight of feudal obligations and a taxation system that seemed designed to keep them in perpetual subservience. This deep-seated imbalance, where privilege was concentrated in the hands of a few while the many bore the burdens, created an environment ripe for profound social upheaval. The perceived injustices, coupled with the Enlightenment ideas of equality and individual rights, have fueled a growing sense of resentment and a desire for fundamental change. France, under the weight of these profound social and economic disparities, was indeed a nation in turmoil, drifting inexorably towards a dramatic and irreversible transformation. Against this backdrop of deep-seated unrest, the summer of 1789 saw tensions reach a critical point. The convocation of the Estates General, an assembly of representatives from all three social orders, had initially offered a glimmer of hope for reform, but it quickly devolved into a stalemate over voting procedures and the fundamental question of power. As the political deadlock continued, the people of Paris grew increasingly agitated, fueled by rumours of royal troops massing around the city and the dismissal of a popular finance minister. On July 14th, 1789, this simmering discontent erupted into a spontaneous act of defiance that would forever mark the beginning of the French Revolution. A large crowd seeking weapons and gunpowder converged upon the Bastille, a medieval fortress in eastern Paris that had long served as a state prison and a potent symbol of royal tyranny. Though it held only a handful of prisoners at the time, its formidable appearance and historical association with arbitrary power made it a focal point for popular anger. The confrontation quickly escalated. After hours of negotiation and rising tensions, the crowd, joined by defecting soldiers, stormed the fortress. The governor of the Bastille and some of his men were killed, and the prisoners were freed. While militarily insignificant, the fall of the Bastille was a moment of profound symbolic importance. It signalled the irreversible collapse of the old order, demonstrating that the absolute authority of the monarchy could be challenged and overthrown by the collective will of the people. This singular event sent shockwaves across France and throughout Europe. It ignited a revolutionary fervour that quickly spread beyond Paris, inspiring uprisings and demands for change in towns and rural areas alike. The storming of the Bastille unleashed a torrent of powerful new ideas that had been fermenting for decades. Ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Liberty, the freedom from oppression and arbitrary rule. Equality, the notion that all citizens should be equal before the law without privilege or distinction of birth. And fraternity, a sense of national unity and shared purpose among the French people. These ideals, though complex and often contested in their application, became the guiding principles of the revolution, promising a radical transformation of society and setting France on an unpredictable and often tumultuous path. As the echoes of the Bastille's fall reverberated across France, Napoleon Bonaparte, a young artillery officer, found himself at a pivotal moment. The revolution, with its radical pronouncements against privilege and its fervent calls for a new social order, resonated deeply with his own aspirations. For a man of modest, noble origins from a recently conquered island, the old aristocratic system offered limited avenues for true advancement. The revolution, however, promised a meritocracy, a world where talent and ability rather than birthright would determine one's destiny. This vision was profoundly appealing to Napoleon, who possessed an extraordinary intellect and an unshakable belief in his own capabilities. He saw the revolution not merely as a political upheaval, but as a vast, unprecedented opportunity. It was a chance for men like him, intelligent and ambitious, to rise through the ranks based on their individual merits. His early political writings from this period reflect a fervent embrace of revolutionary ideals. He penned pamphlets and essays, articulating his support for the new government and its principles. These early works reveal a mind grappling with the profound changes unfolding around him, seeking to align his personal ambitions with the grand sweep of historical transformation. During these formative years, Napoleon's political convictions increasingly aligned with the Jacobin faction, the most radical and influential political club of the Revolution. The Jacobins advocated for a strong, centralized republic, emphasizing civic virtue, popular sovereignty, and a vigorous defense of revolutionary gains against both internal and external enemies. Their rhetoric of unwavering commitment to the nation and their emphasis on the will of the people found a receptive audience in Napoleon. This alignment was particularly evident during his extended leaves in Corsica. There, he actively participated in local revolutionary politics, seeking to implement the new ideals on his home island. He saw himself as a champion of Corsican integration into the revolutionary French Republic, believing that the island's future lay in embracing the new order. He joined local Jacobin clubs, gave speeches, and worked to organize the National Guard, he advocating for the revolutionary cause with passion and conviction. His activities in Corsica during this period were not merely theoretical. They were a practical engagement with the revolutionary process, demonstrating his readiness to act upon his beliefs and his innate drive to lead. He was, in these early years, a sincere believer in the revolution's promise. While Napoleon ardently championed the ideals of the French Revolution, his efforts to implant these principles in Corsica brought him into direct confrontation with a revered figure, Pasquale Paoli. Paoli, a charismatic leader, had been the island's hero of independence against Genoese and then French rule decades prior. He represented a deeply rooted Corsican nationalism, distinct from the new, centralized vision of revolutionary France. Initially, Paoli had welcomed the revolution as an opportunity for greater Corsican autonomy within a reformed French state. However, as the revolution grew more radical, and as Napoleon and his family increasingly aligned themselves with the uncompromising Jacobin faction, Paoli's vision diverged sharply. Napoleon, with his ardent Jacobin sympathies, viewed Paoli's growing resistance to Parisian authority as a betrayal of the revolution itself. He saw Paoli's moves towards greater Corsican self-governance as a dangerous fragmentation, undermining the unity and strength of the new French Republic. This ideological chasm quickly widened into a bitter personal and political struggle. The Bonaparte family, having initially supported Paoli, now found themselves firmly on the side of the French revolutionary government, thus directly opposing the elder statesman. The conflict escalated, fueled by accusations of disloyalty and betrayals on both sides. Napoleon's outspoken criticisms of Paoli and his family's active promotion of French revolutionary interests made them increasingly unpopular with the significant portion of the Corsican population who remained loyal to Paoli's nationalist cause. The island became a microcosm of the larger French revolutionary struggle, with factions vying for control and defining the future of Corsican identity. Ultimately, Paoli, viewing the Jacobin government in Paris as an oppressive force, sought British protection for Corsica. This move cemented the break. The Bonaparte family, now seen as staunch French loyalists by Paoli's supporters, found their position on the island untenable. Their properties were ransacked, and their lives were threatened. In May 1793 they were forced to flee Ajaccio, abandoning their ancestral home and their Corsican roots. This forced exile was a profound turning point. Stripped of their Corsican identity and having burned their bridges with Paoli's followers, the Bonaparte family was now irrevocably French. This expulsion solidified Napoleon's allegiance to France, closing the door on any lingering ambivalence and fully committing him to the destiny of the burgeoning republic. After their expulsion from Corsica, the Bonaparte family found refuge in mainland France. It was amidst this period of uncertainty and upheaval that Napoleon, then a young artillery officer would seize an extraordinary opportunity to distinguish himself. The city of Toulon, a vital French naval port, had rebelled against the increasingly radical revolutionary government, opening its gates to British and Spanish forces. This act of defiance presented a grave threat to the fledgling French Republic, and a siege was mounted to reclaim the city. Napoleon arrived at Toulon in September 1793, holding the rank of captain. The French forces arrayed against the entrenched British and Spanish defenders were disorganised, and their artillery efforts were largely ineffectual. Observing the chaotic situation, Napoleon quickly recognised the strategic weakness of the Allied position. He understood that the key to recapturing Toulon lay not in a direct assault on the city itself, but in seizing the high ground overlooking the harbour. From these commanding positions, artillery could bombard the Allied fleet, forcing its withdrawal and rendering the city indefensible. He proposed a daring plan to capture a series of fortified hills, particularly a promontory known as Little Gibraltar. His superiors, initially sceptical of the young, intense officer, eventually acceded to his persistent arguments and compelling logic. Napoleon then personally oversaw the meticulous placement of numerous artillery batteries, directing their fire with precision and a profound understanding of ballistics. He displayed remarkable courage, often exposing himself to enemy fire to inspect positions and encourage his men. The sustained and accurate French bombardment from the newly captured heights proved devastating. The Allied fleet, vulnerable to the relentless barrage, was compelled to withdraw from the harbour. With their naval support gone, the British and Spanish land forces could no longer hold Toulon. The city fell to the French in December 1793. This pivotal victory at Toulon brought Napoleon immediate national recognition. His innovative tactical thinking and effective command of artillery had turned a faltering siege into a decisive triumph for the Republic. In recognition of his extraordinary service and brilliant strategy, the Committee of Public Safety, the governing body of France at the time, swiftly promoted him to the rank of Brigadier General. At just 24 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte had announced his arrival on the grand stage of European military affairs. While Napoleon's star was ascending on the battlefield, France itself was gripped by a period of intense political paranoia and violence known as the Reign of Terror. From late 1793 through mid-1794, Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety wielded immense power, executing perceived enemies of the revolution by the thousands. Loyalty was fleeting and suspicion was rampant. To be accused was often to be condemned. Napoleon, having aligned himself with the Jacobin faction, and having been a protégé of Augustin Robespierre, Maximilian's younger brother, found himself in a precarious position as the political tides began to turn. His rapid promotion and association with prominent Jacobin figures were both a boon and a potential liability. He had, after all, been an active participant in Corsican Jacobin politics, and had written pamphlets reflecting those sympathies. His success at Toulon had been under the patronage of the very regime that was now beginning to fracture. As the excesses of the terror grew, a reaction began to form within the National Convention. Many deputies feared they would be the next victims. On July 27, 1794, a dramatic coup, known as the Thermidorian Reaction, led to the overthrow and execution of Maximilien Robespierre and his closest allies. The guillotine, which had claimed so many lives, now claimed its most fervent proponent. The fall of Robespierre marked the end of the most extreme phase of the French Revolution. For Napoleon, the immediate aftermath was fraught with danger. His close ties to the Robespierre brothers made him a target for the new authorities, who sought to purge the government and army of those associated with the fallen regime. He was briefly arrested in August 1794 accused of being a terrorist and a Robespierrist. His papers were examined and his future hung in the balance. However, a lack of concrete evidence against him, combined with his undeniable military talent and the pressing need for experienced officers to defend the revolution's gains, ultimately saved him. He was released after a little over a week of detention. Though he faced some initial suspicion and a temporary demotion, his career was not destroyed. He had navigated the treacherous waters of revolutionary politics, demonstrating a remarkable resilience and an ability to adapt to shifting circumstances. The period of the Terror and its dramatic conclusion had been a stark lesson in the volatile nature of power during these revolutionary times. With the end of the Reign of Terror, France sought a more stable form of government. In 1795, a new constitution was adopted, establishing the Directory as the executive body. This new regime was comprised of 5 directors and was intended to provide a moderate Republican leadership, avoiding both the monarchy of the past and the radicalism of the Jacobins. However, the Directory soon became known for its corruption, inefficiency, and its struggle to maintain order amidst ongoing political unrest. Paris, in particular, remained a hotbed of discontent. Royalist factions, eager to restore the monarchy, saw an opportunity in the Directory's perceived weakness and the general public's weariness with revolutionary upheaval. On October 5th, 1795, a significant royalist uprising erupted in the streets of Paris. Thousands of armed insurgents, including sections of the National Guard loyal to the royalist cause, began to march on the Tuileries Palace, where the National Convention was meeting. The situation was dire for the Directory, as its forces were outnumbered and poorly organised. In this moment of crisis, Paul Barras, a leading member of the Directory, remembered the young brigadier general who had so effectively quelled the uprising at Toulon. Napoleon Bonaparte was given command of the troops tasked with defending the convention. He acted with characteristic speed and decisiveness. Recognising the critical importance of artillery, he dispatched his cavalry officer, Joachim Murat, to seize cannons from the Sablons camp just outside the city. Murat, riding swiftly through the night, secured dozens of pieces of artillery and brought them back to Paris. Napoleon strategically positioned these cannons at key intersections leading to the Tuileries. As the royalist column advanced, he held his fire until the last possible moment, allowing the dense crowds to fill the narrow streets. Then, on his command, the cannons unleashed a devastating barrage of grape shot, a canister filled with small iron balls, effectively turning a cannon into a giant shotgun. The effect was immediate and brutal. The tightly packed ranks of the royalists were decimated, and the rebellion was swiftly and decisively crushed. This ruthless efficiency, which Napoleon himself famously described as a whiff of grape shot, saved the Directory and cemented his reputation as a man of action and an indispensable military asset. His quick thinking and unwavering resolve in the face of chaos had once again proven invaluable. Following his decisive action against the royalist rebels in Paris, Napoleon's stature within the Directory grew considerably, and he was now seen not merely as a talented brigadier general, but as a potential saviour of the Republican government. It was around this time, in the vibrant social circles of post-Thermidorian Paris, that he encountered a woman who would profoundly impact his life and destiny, Joséphine de Beauharnais. Born Marie-Joseph, Rosie, Tachère de la Pagerie on the island of Martinique, Joséphine was a widow with 2 children, Eugène and Hortense. Her first husband, Alexandre de Beauharnais, a prominent general, had been guillotined during the Reign of Terror, leaving her to navigate the often perilous social landscape of revolutionary France. She was 6 years older than Napoleon, possessed an elegance and a worldly charm that the young, somewhat provincial Corsican officer found captivating. Their initial meeting is often described as occurring through a somewhat unusual circumstance. Josephine's son, Eugène, then a young boy, sought out General Bonaparte to request the return of his father's sword, which had been confiscated during the Revolution. Napoleon, touched by the boy's earnest plea, granted the request. Josephine subsequently visited Napoleon to express her gratitude, and it was during this encounter that their connection began to form. Napoleon, despite his military brilliance, was socially somewhat awkward and inexperienced in matters of the heart. Josephine, with her grace, sophistication, and engaging conversational style, represented a world of Parisian high society that was new to him. She moved with an effortless charm that drew people to her, and her past experiences had given her a resilience and certain knowing gaze. He was captivated by her poise and her allure. His letters from this period reveal a man deeply smitten, expressing an ardent and sometimes overwhelming affection. While Josephine may have initially viewed the intense, ambitious general with a degree of pragmatism, perhaps seeing him as a rising star who could offer security and position, a genuine connection began to blossom. Their relationship from its very inception was marked by a blend of passionate intensity, social calculation, and a profound, if sometimes tumultuous, emotional bond that would shape both their personal lives and the course of history. With his reputation cemented by his actions in Paris, and his personal life now entwined with Josephine, Napoleon's ambitions turned once more to the grand stage of military command. The Directory, seeking to consolidate its power and extend French influence, devised a strategy to strike at the heart of the First Coalition, primarily targeting Austria. While the main thrust of this offensive was planned for the Rhine frontier, a secondary yet strategically important campaign was envisioned for Italy. Italy at this time was not a unified nation, but a collection of various states, many of which were under Austrian influence or allied with the coalition. Control of northern Italy, particularly the wealthy regions of Lombardy and Piedmont, offered significant strategic advantages. It could serve as a vital source of supplies and tribute for the French Republic, and a successful campaign there could divert Austrian resources from the Rhine, or weakening their overall war effort. Despite its potential, the French army of Italy was considered a peripheral force, neglected and undersupplied. Its soldiers were often poorly clothed, irregularly paid, and morale was generally low. It was seen as a difficult command, a place where careers might stall rather than flourish. Yet it was precisely this challenging assignment that Napoleon Bonaparte, still a relatively young general, sought and ultimately received. His appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Italy on March 2, 1796, was a testament to his growing political connections and the trust placed in him by influential figures within the Directory, notably Paul Barras. It was also perhaps a way for some to send the ambitious general to a less prominent theatre, away from the immediate power struggles of Paris. However, for Napoleon, this was not a banishment but an unparalleled opportunity. He arrived at the headquarters in Nice with a clear vision and an unshakable confidence in his own abilities. The task before him was formidable: to transform a dispirited and ill-equipped force into a potent instrument of war, capable of challenging the well-established Austrian and Piedmontese armies. He understood the immense strategic importance of this theatre, recognizing that a decisive victory in Italy could fundamentally alter the balance of power in Europe and elevate his own standing to an unprecedented degree. The stage was now set for one of the most remarkable campaigns in military history, a campaign that would truly introduce the world to the genius of Napoleon Bonaparte. Upon his arrival at the headquarters of the Army of Italy, Napoleon Bonaparte encountered a scene of disarray. The troops were underfed, their uniforms were ragged, and their morale was low. They were an army forgotten, stationed in a difficult mountainous region, awaiting a new commander who was largely unknown to them, a young general from Corsica. Napoleon, however, possessed an extraordinary understanding of human psychology. He immediately set about transforming this dispirited force. His first actions were not grand strategic pronouncements, but rather direct addresses to the soldiers themselves. He spoke to them not as a distant authority, but as a leader who understood their plight and offered a tangible path forward. His speeches were carefully crafted, yet delivered with a fiery conviction that resonated deeply. He promised them glory, honour, and riches that awaited them in the fertile plains of Italy. He spoke of liberating the Italian people from Austrian oppression, appealing to the revolutionary ideals that still stirred many hearts. He famously declared, "Soldiers, you are naked, ill-fed. The government owes you much, it can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honour, glory, and riches. Soldiers of Italy, will you be wanting in courage or steadfastness?" Beyond these inspiring words, Napoleon also implemented strict discipline. He reorganized supply lines, ensuring that the soldiers received better provisions even if they were still meagre. He enforced order and obedience, making it clear that while rewards would be plentiful for valour, and consequences would be swift for insubordination, he instilled a sense of purpose, convincing them that they were not merely a forgotten army, but the vanguard of a new era, destined for greatness. His presence was magnetic. He rode among them, often sharing their hardships, demonstrating a personal courage that earned their respect. He learned the names of his officers and spoke directly to the common soldiers, fostering a sense of loyalty that transcended mere duty. Within a remarkably short period, Napoleon transformed the army of Italy from a collection of weary men into a formidable fighting machine, infused with a new spirit and an unwavering belief in their young general. Their immediate future, and indeed the future of France, would now be shaped by this revitalized force. With his revitalized army, Napoleon embarked on a series of campaigns that would redefine military strategy and establish his legendary reputation. The spring of 1796 saw the commencement of his Italian campaign, a testament to his audacious vision and the unwavering belief he had instilled in his troops. His initial target was the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, allied with Austria. At Montenotte, in April 1796, Napoleon skillfully divided and defeated the Austrian and Sardinian forces separately, preventing their convergence. This swift victory was followed by a relentless pursuit, driving the Sardinians back, culminating in the armistice of Cherasco, forcing them out of the war and securing valuable territory for France. Next, Napoleon turned his attention to the larger Austrian armies. He understood the importance of speed and surprise, often moving his forces with an agility that bewildered his adversaries. At the Battle of Lodi, in May 1796, French troops, led by Napoleon himself, stormed across a narrow bridge under heavy enemy fire. This bold, almost reckless manoeuvre, though costly, shattered Austrian morale and opened the path to Milan. It was at Lodi that his soldiers reportedly bestowed upon him the affectionate nickname Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, a sign of their growing admiration and trust. The campaign continued with a series of engagements designed to outmaneuver and isolate Austrian forces attempting to relieve the besieged city of Mantua. The battles of Arcole in November 1796 and Rivoli in January 1797 showcased Napoleon's tactical genius. At Arcole, amidst treacherous marshlands, he personally led a charge across a bridge, just inspiring his weary troops to secure a vital crossing. Rivoli, a more conventional battle, saw Napoleon brilliantly deploy his forces to defeat a numerically superior Austrian army, sealing the fate of Mantua and effectively ending the Austrian presence in Italy. These victories were not merely triumphs of force, but of intellect and daring. Napoleon consistently demonstrated an ability to assess complex battlefield situations, anticipate enemy movements, and strike with decisive speed. He broke conventional military doctrines, emphasizing rapid marches, concentrated attacks, and the relentless pursuit of a shattered foe. His Italian campaign unfolded as a masterclass in aggressive, innovative warfare, solidifying his image as a military prodigy and sending ripples of concern across the monarchies of Europe. Following the resounding victories in Italy, the time came to solidify the gains through diplomatic channels. Napoleon, not content to leave the complex negotiations to the Directory in Paris, took it upon himself to conduct the peace talks directly with Austria. This was a significant departure from established protocols, where military commanders typically executed orders and left statecraft to civilian leadership. His independent initiative underscored his rapidly expanding influence and his growing conviction in his own political acumen. The negotiations culminated in the Treaty of Campo Formio, signed on October 17, 1797. This momentous agreement brought a formal end to the War of the First Coalition, a conflict that had engulfed Europe for years. The terms of the treaty were highly favourable to France, and reflected the undeniable military superiority Napoleon had demonstrated. Under the provisions of Campo Formio, Austria ceded the Austrian Netherlands, which is modern-day Belgium, to France. More significantly, it recognised the newly established Cisalpine Republic in northern Italy, a French client state formed from territories Napoleon had conquered, including Lombardy. In exchange for these substantial concessions, Austria received Venice, Istria, and Dalmatia, a compensation that allowed the Habsburg monarchy to save face while still acknowledging France's dominant position. The treaty also contained secret clauses, a common practice of the era, which further delineated spheres of influence and laid the groundwork for future territorial adjustments within the Holy Roman Empire. For Napoleon, Campo Formio was more than just a peace agreement. It was a personal triumph that elevated him beyond the status of a mere general. He had not only won a war, but had also dictated the terms of peace to a major European power, demonstrating a political astuteness that surprised many. This diplomatic success underscored his understanding of both military and political power, marking him as a figure of immense consequence on the European stage. He returned to France not just as a victorious general, but as a statesman who had reshaped the map of Europe. With peace secured on the continent, Napoleon's restless ambition turned towards a new, more distant horizon. The formidable power of Great Britain remained unchecked, its naval dominance a constant challenge to French aspirations. A direct invasion of England was deemed too hazardous, given the strength of the Royal Navy. Instead, Napoleon conceived of an audacious plan that would strike at the heart of British economic power: an expedition to Egypt. The primary strategic goal of this venture, launched in 1798, was to disrupt Britain's vital trade routes to India. India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, a source of immense wealth and influence. By establishing a French presence in Egypt, Napoleon envisioned cutting off this crucial artery, thereby weakening Britain and forcing it to negotiate on French terms. It was a grand, almost fantastical scheme, reflecting the scale of his strategic thinking. The preparations for the Egyptian campaign were shrouded in an intense veil of secrecy. Tens of thousands of seasoned troops, a vast fleet of transports and powerful warships were assembled in various French ports, their ultimate destination kept hidden from even most of the high-ranking officers. This secrecy was paramount to avoid alerting the British Navy, which patrolled the Mediterranean with vigilance. Beyond its military objectives, the expedition carried a unique and ambitious scientific dimension. Napoleon ever keen to project an image of enlightened leadership, included a large contingent of scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers, known collectively as the savants. These learned individuals were tasked with studying the ancient wonders of Egypt, documenting its flora and fauna, mapping its geography, and unravelling the mysteries of its civilization. This intellectual component was unprecedented for a military campaign, transforming it into an expedition of discovery as much as one of conquest. The sheer scale of this combined military and scientific undertaking spoke volumes about Napoleon's vision. It was a project that blended strategic military ambition with a profound curiosity for knowledge and a desire to bring glory to France, not only through conquest, but also through intellectual enlightenment. The journey itself across the Mediterranean would be fraught with peril, but the potential rewards, both strategic and cultural, seemed immense. The French army, after a difficult march across the desert, finally approached Cairo in July of 1798. Before them, stretching across the horizon, lay the ancient majestic pyramids of Giza, with their silent forms standing sentinel over millennia. It was in this extraordinary setting under the vast Egyptian sky that a crucial engagement would unfold. Opposing Napoleon's forces were the Mamluks, the ruling military caste of Egypt. Renowned for their superb horsemanship and fierce courage, the Mamluk cavalry presented a formidable sight, their ornate attire and gleaming weapons a stark contrast to the disciplined blue ranks of the French infantry. Their leader, Murad Bey, commanded a substantial force, confident in the Mamluks' traditional dominance in battle. Napoleon, ever the astute tactician, understood the strengths and weaknesses of his adversary. He knew that the Mamluk cavalry, while individually brave and skilled, lacked the disciplined organisation and coordinated firepower of his European-trained infantry. To counter their charges, he deployed his army in massive hollow squares, a formation designed to present an impenetrable wall of bayonets and muskets in every direction. Artillery was placed at the corners of these squares, ready to unleash devastating volleys. On July 21st, the Mamluks launched their charge. Wave after wave of cavalry thundered across the sands, their cries echoing across the plain, seeking to break the French formations. Yet the squares held firm. The French infantry, despite the oppressive heat and the intimidating spectacle of the charging horsemen, maintained their composure, firing synchronized volleys that cut swathes through the Mamluk ranks. The disciplined musketry proved devastating against the Mamluks' less coordinated attacks. The battle, later known as the Battle of the Pyramids, was a decisive victory for the French. The Mamluk forces were shattered, their leadership dispersed, and their power in Egypt effectively broken. The road to Cairo was now open, and Napoleon's army entered the city shortly after, establishing French control over the heart of Egypt. The silent pyramids bore witness to this modern clash, a testament to the enduring power of disciplined organisation over traditional martial prowess. While Napoleon's army was consolidating its victory on land, a profound change was brewing at sea, one that would dramatically alter the course of the entire Egyptian campaign. The French fleet, which had transported Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, lay anchored in Aboukir Bay, near the mouth of the Nile. Its position, seemingly secure, was about to be challenged by an adversary of immense skill and determination. Admiral Horatio Nelson, commanding the British fleet, had relentlessly pursued the French across the Mediterranean. Driven by a keen strategic mind and an unwavering resolve, Nelson finally located the French ships on August 1st, 1798. Despite the late hour and the perceived safety of the French anchorage, Nelson made the audacious decision to attack immediately, even at night. The Battle of the Nile, sometimes referred to as the Battle of Aboukir Bay, began as the sun began to set. Nelson's brilliant tactic involved sailing some of his ships between the French vessels and the shore, effectively trapping them and allowing the British to attack from both sides. The close-quarters naval combat was fierce and brutal, illuminated by the flashes of cannon fire and the burning hulks of ships. Through the long night, the battle raged. The concentrated British fire proved devastating. One by one, French ships succumbed, their mast crashing down, their hulls ablaze. The French flagship L'Orient exploded in a spectacular conflagration that lit up the entire bay, a moment of terrible beauty witnessed by both sides. By the morning of August 2nd, the extent of the disaster for the French was clear. Of the 13 French ships of the line, only 2 managed to escape. The vast majority were captured or destroyed. This catastrophic loss effectively annihilated French naval power in the Mediterranean and, crucially, severed Napoleon's army from France. Supplies, reinforcements, and the very means of return were now cut off. The Battle of the Nile was a strategic calamity for Napoleon. His ambitious Egyptian venture, once filled with promise, has now faced the grim reality of isolation. The desert sands, once a path to conquest, now seem to stretch endlessly, a silent barrier between the stranded army and its distant homeland. With the fleet destroyed and the path home uncertain, Napoleon and his army were compelled to settle into an extended occupation of Egypt. Beyond the military objectives, Napoleon had brought with him an extensive contingent of scholars, scientists and artists, over 160 savants, who now set about systematically studying the ancient land. This intellectual endeavour gave rise to the Institut d'Égypte, a centre for research and discovery. One of the most significant finds during this period was made by a French soldier in 1799 near the town of Rosetta. This discovery was a dark granodiorite stele, inscribed with 3 distinct scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and ancient Greek. This artifact, later known as the Rosetta Stone, would prove to be the key to unlocking the mysteries of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, a language that had been unreadable for centuries. Its significance for Egyptology was immense, opening entirely new windows into a forgotten civilization. While the savants delved into history and science, Napoleon also attempted to establish an administration for Egypt. He sought to implement reforms, to modernize aspects of governance, and to win over the local population. He established a divan, a council of local religious and civil leaders, to advise him and to help bridge the cultural gap. Proclamations were issued in Arabic, attempting to portray the French as liberators from Mamluk oppression and as respectful of Islamic traditions. However, the occupation was fraught with immense challenges. The French soldiers, accustomed to Europe, struggled with the harsh desert climate, unfamiliar diseases, and a drastically different way of life. The local population, despite initial efforts at conciliation, often viewed the French as foreign invaders rather than liberators. Taxation, cultural misunderstandings, and the presence of an occupying army fueled resentment. Revolts, such as the Cairo uprising in October 1798, demonstrated the deep resistance to French rule. These uprisings were suppressed with considerable force, further straining relations. The dream of a stable, French-administered Egypt, a new outpost of French influence, proved difficult to realise. The army, now isolated and facing constant low-level resistance, found itself in a challenging, often hostile environment, afar from the familiar comforts of home. The grand vision of the Egyptian campaign was increasingly overshadowed by the practical difficulties of occupation. As the summer of 1799 drew to a close, Napoleon's strategic mind, ever attuned to the shifting tides of power, began to perceive a new opportunity, one far removed from the sands of Egypt. News, albeit delayed and often incomplete, gradually reached him regarding the political turmoil unfolding in France. The Directory, the 5-man executive body that governed the nation, was increasingly unpopular and viewed as weak and corrupt. Military reversals in Europe, particularly against the Second Coalition, further eroded public confidence. Napoleon, despite his isolation in Egypt, possessed a remarkable intuition for the pulse of national sentiment and the vulnerability of political structures. He saw that the Directory was teetering, ripe for a decisive change. He understood that a strong leader, one with military prestige and popular appeal, could potentially step into this void and reshape the destiny of France. He recognized that the Egyptian campaign, while yielding scientific treasures, was not bringing him the decisive military glory that could propel him to ultimate political power. His thoughts turned increasingly homeward, away from the difficult realities of administering a resistant Egypt and toward the potential for a grander stage. The strategic value of his presence in Egypt, particularly after the destruction of the fleet at the Nile, had diminished significantly. The British control of the Mediterranean made resupply and reinforcement perilous, and the army, though still formidable, was effectively marooned. Napoleon made a momentous and clandestine decision. He resolved to abandon his army in Egypt, leaving its command to General Jean-Baptiste Kleber, and to return to France. This was a calculated risk, a move that could be perceived as desertion, yet it was driven by an acute awareness of the political climate and his own ambition. He believed that the moment in France was fleeting, a window of opportunity that would not remain open indefinitely. On August 22, 1799, under the cloak of secrecy, Napoleon boarded the frigate Muiron, accompanied by a small retinue of loyal officers and savants. He slipped away from the Egyptian coast, navigating the British blockade, driven by an unwavering belief that his destiny lay not in the Near East, but in the heart of France. He was returning not as a defeated general, but as a man poised to seize control of a nation in turmoil, sensing that the time for his ascent had finally arrived. His journey was a race against time, a gamble for supreme power. Upon his unexpected return to France in October 1799, Napoleon was greeted not with accusations of desertion, but with widespread public acclaim. The people, weary of the Directory's inefficiency and the constant threat of war, saw in him a potential saviour, a strong leader who could restore order and national pride. This popular sentiment provided the crucial backdrop for the events that would soon unfold. Key political figures, notably Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, one of the 5 directors, and Roger Ducos. Another director had already been plotting to overthrow the existing government. They recognized the need for a military figure to lend authority and force to their plans, and Napoleon, with his immense popularity and military prestige, was the ideal candidate. He quickly joined their conspiracy, bringing his strategic acumen and decisive temperament to the political arena. The coup, meticulously planned yet executed with a degree of improvised audacity, commenced on November 9, 1799, or 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar. The initial phase involved a manufactured crisis. Members of the Council of Ancients, one of the 2 legislative bodies, were persuaded to move both legislative councils, the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500, to the Château de Saint-Cloud, just outside Paris. The pretext was a fabricated Jacobin plot, designed to justify the relocation and the need for military protection, with Napoleon being placed in command of all troops in Paris. The following day, November 10th, proved more challenging. When Napoleon attempted to address the Council of 500, he was met with hostility and shouts of "Down with the tyrant and outlaw him!" The scene became chaotic, and Napoleon, unaccustomed to such direct political confrontation, briefly faltered. His brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who was president of the Council of 500, played a critical role in this moment. He dramatically appealed to the soldiers guarding the assembly, claiming that a minority of deputies were holding the majority hostage and attempting to assassinate Napoleon. This appeal, when coupled with the arrival of soldiers led by Joachim Murat, Napoleon's brother-in-law, ultimately broke the deadlock. The grenadiers cleared the hall, dispersing the deputies. With the legislative bodies effectively dissolved, the conspirators then moved to establish a new government. The coup of 18 Brumaire thus culminated in the abolition of the Directory and the creation of the consulate. This new system of government was nominally led by 3 consuls, but it was clear from the outset that Napoleon, as first consul, would hold the dominant power. The swift and decisive seizure of power marked a profound turning point in French history, bringing an end to the revolutionary period and ushering in an era defined by Napoleon's singular authority. Following the swift events of 18 Brumaire, a new constitution was quickly drafted and promulgated in December 1799. This document established the consulate, ostensibly a government of 3 consuls. Yet the carefully constructed framework ensured that power was not equally distributed. Napoleon Bonaparte was designated first consul, a position that granted him far greater authority than his 2 counterparts, Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambacérès and Charles-François Lebrun, who served as second and third consuls respectively. The first consul held the real executive power. He possessed the authority to appoint ministers, ambassadors, and judges, to initiate legislation, and to control the army. The other 2 consuls served primarily in an advisory capacity, their roles largely ceremonial in comparison to Napoleon's expansive responsibilities. This hierarchical structure was a deliberate design, intended to consolidate power in the hands of a single strong leader, a stark contrast to the often divided and ineffective directory that preceded it. Under Napoleon's firm hand, the period of revolutionary instability, which had plagued France for a decade, gradually began to subside. The constant shifts in government, the factional infighting, and the widespread uncertainty that characterized the preceding years gave way to a more centralized and seemingly stable administration. Napoleon understood that the French people yearned for order and an end to the perpetual upheaval. He set about creating a government that projected strength and efficiency. His authority was not merely military, it was also administrative and political. He began to reform the state apparatus, addressing issues of finance, law, and public order with a pragmatic and often authoritarian approach. This consolidation of power marked a significant departure from the revolutionary ideals of shared governance and direct popular participation. While the forms of republicanism were maintained, the substance of power resided firmly with the first consul. The establishment of the consulate, with Napoleon at its undisputed head, brought a definitive close to the volatile revolutionary decade. France transitioned from a period of fervent ideological struggle and governmental flux to an era dominated by the will and vision of one man. This shift laid the groundwork for the profound transformations that would follow, as Napoleon began to reshape not only France, but also the wider European landscape, all under the guise of restoring peace and prosperity. With the reins of power firmly in his grasp as first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte immediately turned his formidable energy toward bringing lasting stability and order to a France weary from years of revolution and war. His approach was pragmatic and systematic, reflecting his military training and his deep understanding of administrative efficiency. He recognized that true peace at home required more than just a strong government. It demanded a functioning economy and a reliable infrastructure. One of his most significant initial reforms was the overhaul of the nation's finances. The revolutionary governments had struggled with inflation, debt, and inconsistent taxation, leading to widespread economic instability. Napoleon sought to rectify this by establishing the Bank of France in 1800. This central institution was designed to stabilize the currency, manage the national debt, and provide credit to the government and the economy. It was a crucial step in restoring confidence in the French financial system, laying a solid foundation for future economic growth. Beyond finance, Napoleon embarked on a comprehensive program of administrative centralization. He reformed the local government structure, appointing prefects to oversee each department. These prefects, directly accountable to the first consul, ensured that government policies were implemented uniformly and efficiently across the entire nation. This system replaced the often chaotic and fragmented local administrations of the revolutionary era, yet bringing a new level of coherence and control to the state. His vision extended to the very fabric of daily life. Napoleon initiated numerous public works projects aimed at improving the nation's infrastructure. Roads were repaired and expanded, facilitating trade and troop movements. Canals were dug to connect waterways, further enhancing internal commerce. Bridges were constructed, linking communities and strengthening national unity. These projects not only provided employment, but also visibly demonstrated the new government's commitment to progress and the well-being of its citizens. Paris, as the heart of France, received particular attention. Napoleon commissioned the construction of new markets, fountains, and monuments, seeking to restore the grandeur of the capital and symbolize the nation's renewed strength. Yet these improvements were not merely aesthetic, they were practical enhancements designed to improve sanitation, water supply, and public amenities. Through these wide-ranging reforms, Napoleon systematically addressed the fundamental issues that had plagued France for so long. He brought a sense of purpose and direction, replacing uncertainty with a clear vision for a stable, ordered, and prosperous nation. These efforts to rebuild and modernize were instrumental in consolidating his power and earning him the quiet gratitude of a populace yearning for peace. Among Napoleon's many undertakings to reshape France, one stands out as a testament to his ambition and foresight, becoming perhaps his most enduring legacy, the Civil Code of 1804. This monumental legal framework, eventually known as the Napoleonic Code, sought to rationalize and standardize the disparate and often contradictory laws that had accumulated in France over centuries and through the tumultuous revolutionary period. Before its creation, French law was a patchwork of Roman law in the south, customary law in the north, and a myriad of revolutionary decrees, leading to confusion and inequality. Napoleon himself took a keen interest in its development, presiding over many of the Council of State's drafting sessions, contributing his pragmatic insights and ensuring its clarity and consistency. The code was designed to embody the key principles of the French Revolution, albeit in a carefully moderated form, translating revolutionary ideals into practical enforceable statutes. At its core, the Napoleonic Code enshrined the principle of equality before the law. It abolished feudal privileges and established that all male citizens were equal in the eyes of the law, regardless of birth or social standing. This was a profound departure from the old aristocratic order and a cornerstone of modern jurisprudence. Furthermore, the code meticulously defined and protected property rights, recognizing the importance of individual ownership and economic freedom. It provided clear rules for contracts, inheritance, and land ownership, which were vital for a stable economy and a functioning society. This emphasis on clear property rights fostered economic activity and provided a sense of security for citizens. While progressive in many respects, particularly for its time, the code also reflected some societal norms of the era. It affirmed the authority of the husband over his wife and children within the family unit, and it limited women's legal rights in certain areas. Despite these limitations, its overall impact was transformative. The influence of the Napoleonic Code extended far beyond the borders of France. As Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, they often brought the code with them, either imposing it directly or inspiring similar legal reforms in conquered territories and allied states. Its logical structure, clarity, and emphasis on fundamental rights made it an attractive model for many nations striving to modernize their legal systems. To this day, elements of the Napoleonic Code can be found in the civil law systems of numerous countries across Europe, Latin America, and even parts of Africa and Asia, a quiet echo of a restless mind. Beyond the legal restructuring of the nation, Napoleon recognized another profound source of societal division that needed mending: the schism between the French state and the Catholic Church. The revolution had violently severed ties with Rome, confiscated church property, and subjected the clergy to state control, leading to deep resentment among many devout French citizens. This conflict had fueled civil unrest, particularly in rural areas, and presented a persistent challenge to national unity. With his characteristic pragmatism, Napoleon understood that lasting stability required reconciliation. Though not a deeply religious man himself, he grasped the immense cultural and spiritual importance of Catholicism to the French populace. Therefore, he initiated negotiations with Pope Pius VII, leading to the signing of the Concordat of 1801. This agreement was a masterful stroke of statecraft, carefully balancing the interests of the state with the needs of the Church. Under the terms of the Concordat, Catholicism was recognized as the religion of the great majority of French citizens, but not as the official state religion, thus maintaining a degree of religious freedom. The Pope, in turn, recognized the legitimacy of the French Republic and accepted the loss of church lands that had been confiscated during the Revolution. Critically, the Concordat stipulated that bishops would be nominated by the first consul and then consecrated by the Pope, giving the state significant influence over the clergy while restoring papal authority in spiritual matters. Priests were to be paid by the state, effectively making them civil servants, yet they were allowed to resume public worship freely. This arrangement brought an end to a decade of bitter religious strife, healing a deep wound within French society. The Concordat was not without its critics on both sides, but it effectively restored social harmony and allowed Napoleon to consolidate his power further. It demonstrated his astute understanding of the French people and his ability to employ diplomacy, even with former adversaries, to achieve his political goals. This reconciliation with the Church was a vital step in pacifying a nation weary of conflict, allowing its citizens to once again find solace in their faith, while simultaneously strengthening the hand of the new government. With France largely pacified and his authority firmly established through a series of sweeping reforms and strategic reconciliations, Napoleon's ambitions began to reach beyond the role of first consul. The perpetual threat of assassination plots, real or perceived, and the desire to create a stable hereditary succession that would prevent any return to the chaos of the revolution fueled a growing sentiment for a more permanent form of leadership. The idea of a republic, while initially cherished, now seemed insufficient to guarantee the long-term security and glory of France. Thus, in May of 1804, a plebiscite was held, overwhelmingly approving the establishment of an empire. On December 2, 1804, a grand ceremony unfolded at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, marking the definitive transition from first consul to Emperor of the French. This coronation was meticulously orchestrated by Napoleon himself, a spectacle designed to legitimize his rule and project an image of imperial grandeur to both France and the watching world. Pope Pius VII travelled from Rome to attend, lending religious sanction to the event, However, in a move that resonated with profound symbolism, Napoleon famously took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it upon his own head. He then proceeded to crown his beloved wife Josephine as Empress. This gesture was a deliberate statement, asserting that his power derived not from divine right or papal authority, but from his own will, his military genius, and the will of the French people. It underscored his self-made status, a man who had risen from humble beginnings on Corsica to become the undisputed ruler of a vast empire. The creation of the First French Empire marked a dramatic shift in the political landscape of Europe. It formally ended the Republican phase of the Revolution and ushered in an era of unprecedented personal rule. The coronation was more than a mere title change. It was the birth of a new dynasty, a new order, and a clear declaration of Napoleon's intent to reshape the continent according to his vision. With the imperial crown now firmly on his head, Napoleon Bonaparte stood ready to embark upon the next chapter of his extraordinary life, one that would see him dominate European affairs for over a decade. With the imperial title secured, Napoleon turned his attention to the instrument that had always been the foundation of his power, the army. This formidable force, which would come to be known as the Grande Armée, then was not merely a collection of soldiers, but a meticulously organised and highly motivated fighting machine, forged through years of revolutionary warfare and Napoleon's own innovative command. It represented the very essence of French military prowess and loyalty to its emperor. The Grande Armée was structured with an efficiency unseen in previous European armies. It was divided into self-sufficient corps, each comprising infantry, cavalry, artillery, and support services. This modular organisation allowed for rapid independent movement and dispersed foraging, yet enabled swift concentration on the battlefield when needed. Each corps, commanded by a marshal, a trusted veteran promoted on merit, was capable of fighting a battle on its own for a day, giving Napoleon crucial flexibility and speed. And training within the Grande Armée was rigorous and constant, emphasising not just drill and discipline, but also initiative and adaptability. Soldiers were instilled with a fierce sense of national pride and a deep personal devotion to Napoleon himself. He cultivated this loyalty through regular inspections, personal addresses, and a meritocratic system that allowed any soldier, regardless of birth, to rise through the ranks based on talent and bravery. The famous Imperial Guard, an elite corps, served as both a strategic reserve and a symbol of this unwavering allegiance. This military machine was a reflection of its commander's genius. It was an army designed for aggressive, decisive campaigns, capable of rapid marches, complex manoeuvres, and devastating attacks. The Grande Armée was not simply a tool of conquest. It was an extension of Napoleon's will, ready to enforce his imperial ambitions across the European continent. Its formidable capabilities would soon be tested in a series of monumental conflicts that would redefine the map and destiny of nations. The year 1805 brought with it a renewed coalition against France, as Austria and Russia joined Great Britain in the Third Coalition, seeking to curb Napoleon's burgeoning power. As the Grande Armée marched eastward, it culminated in a monumental confrontation near the town of Austerlitz, a battle that would forever be etched into the annals of military history as Napoleon's strategic masterpiece. This engagement, often called the Battle of the Three Emperors, pitted Napoleon against the combined forces of Emperor Francis I of Austria and Tsar Alexander I of Russia. Napoleon, though outnumbered, masterfully exploited the overconfidence and strategic misjudgments of his adversaries. He deliberately presented a weak right flank, seemingly inviting the Allied commanders to commit a significant portion of their forces to its envelopment. This was a calculated deception, a lure designed to stretch their lines and create a critical vulnerability in their centre. He also made a show of negotiating for peace just before the battle, further reinforcing the Allied belief that he was hesitant and vulnerable. As the morning mist began to lift on December 2nd, 1805, the Allied armies, eager to exploit what they perceived as a French weakness, began their assault on Napoleon's right flank. Their movements, however, left the Pratzen Heights, a crucial elevated plateau at the centre of the battlefield, lightly defended. This was the moment Napoleon had anticipated. With the sun, famously dubbed the Sun of Austerlitz, breaking through the fog, he unleashed his main force. Marshal Soult's corps, hidden until this precise moment, launched a swift and devastating assault on the Pratzen Heights. The French charge up the Pratzen Heights caught the Allied centre completely by surprise. The rapid seizure of this commanding ground split the Austro-Russian forces in two, severing their command and communication. With their centre shattered, the Allied left flank, which had been pressing forward against the seemingly weak French right, found itself isolated and vulnerable. Napoleon then wheeled his forces to crush these isolated enemy formations, driving many into frozen ponds where hundreds perished. The victory at Austerlitz was absolute and devastating for the Third Coalition. It showcased Napoleon's unparalleled ability to read the battlefield, deceive his enemies, and execute a complex plan with precision. The battle effectively dissolved the Third Coalition, forcing Austria to sign the Treaty of Pressburg and significantly altering the political landscape of Central Europe. It solidified Napoleon's reputation as the greatest military commander of his age, a genius capable of orchestrating triumph against formidable odds. Following the stunning success at Austerlitz, Napoleon's ambitions continued to expand, and the shifting alliances of Europe soon brought him into conflict with Prussia. The Prussian military, steeped in the traditions of Frederick the Great, still held a high opinion of itself, although its organisation and tactics had not kept pace with the rapid innovations of the French. In 1806, Prussia, emboldened by British subsidies and a belief in its own superiority, declared war on France, prompting Napoleon to once again lead the Grande Armée eastward. The ensuing campaign culminated in a pair of decisive battles fought on the same day, October 14th, 1806, near the towns of Jena and Auerstedt. These engagements would utterly dismantle the Prussian army and demonstrate with undeniable clarity the profound superiority of Napoleon's military system. At Jena, Napoleon himself led the main body of the Grande Armée against what he believed to be the primary Prussian force, under the command of Prince Hohenlohe. The French, employing their characteristic speed and aggressive tactics, swiftly overwhelmed the Prussian lines, and Napoleon's use of artillery combined with coordinated infantry and cavalry attacks systematically broke Prussian resistance. The battle quickly devolved into a rout, with the Prussian forces scattering in disarray, suffering immense casualties, and losing vast quantities of equipment. Unbeknownst to Napoleon, however, the bulk of the Prussian army, under the command of King Frederick William III and Duke Charles William Ferdinand of Brunswick, was engaged just a few miles to the north, near Auerstedt. Here, a single French corps, commanded by Marshal Davout, faced a force more than twice its size. In a display of extraordinary discipline, courage, and tactical brilliance, Davout's relatively small contingent held its ground against repeated Prussian assaults. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the French infantry squares repelled the Prussian cavalry, and Davout's well-coordinated movements gradually gained the upper hand. The Prussians, unable to break the French lines, eventually began to falter and then to retreat in chaos. The twin victories of Jena and Auerstedt were a catastrophic blow to Prussia. The myth of Prussian invincibility was shattered, and their army was effectively annihilated as a fighting force. Napoleon's swift campaign and these decisive battles led to the occupation of Berlin and the complete subjugation of Prussia, underscoring the revolutionary effectiveness of the Grand Armée's core system, its mobility, and the dynamic leadership of its marshals. Having secured dominance over much of continental Europe through military might, Napoleon still faced the persistent challenge of Great Britain. A direct invasion had proven unfeasible due to British naval supremacy, most notably demonstrated at Trafalgar. Consequently, Napoleon turned to economic warfare, seeking to cripple Britain by severing its vital trade links. This strategy became known as the Continental System. In 1806, with the issuance of the Berlin Decree, Napoleon formally initiated the blockade. This decree declared all trade with Great Britain illegal and ordered the seizure of British goods and ships in any port under French control or influence. The Milan Decree, issued in 1807, further intensified these measures, stating that any ship that had traded with Britain or submitted to British inspection was liable to be seized by French authorities. The aim was clear: to isolate Britain economically, leading to widespread unemployment and social unrest, thereby forcing its government to sue for peace. However, implementing and enforcing the Continental System proved to be a formidable and ultimately insurmountable task. Britain, with its vast global empire and powerful navy, was able to find alternative markets and engage in extensive smuggling operations. The blockade also created significant hardship across Europe. Many continental economies relied heavily on British manufactured goods and colonial products such as sugar, coffee, and tobacco. The scarcity and inflated prices of these items fueled discontent and resentment among the populations of French-controlled territories and Allied states. Furthermore, the system required constant vigilance and enforcement, compelling Napoleon to extend his control and influence ever wider across the continent. This need to ensure compliance often led to renewed military interventions and annexations, drawing France into further conflicts and stretching its resources. Portugal, for instance, refused to comply, leading to the Peninsular War. The Continental System, while conceived as a way to defeat Britain, inadvertently became a primary driver of Napoleon's ongoing expansion and a source of considerable friction within his vast empire, sowing seeds of future resistance. The complications arising from the Continental System soon began to demand more direct intervention from Napoleon. One nation that consistently defied the French embargo on British trade was Portugal, a long-standing ally of Great Britain. Its refusal to close its ports to British shipping was an open challenge to Napoleon's economic strategy. In late 1807, Napoleon, with the cooperation of Spain, sent General Junot's army through Spanish territory to invade Portugal. The Portuguese royal family, sensing the inevitable, fled to Brazil, and Lisbon was occupied without significant resistance. This initial success, however, quickly spiraled into a much larger, more protracted conflict that would come to be known as the Peninsular War. While French troops were in Spain, en route to Portugal, Napoleon began to harbour designs on Spain itself. The Spanish monarchy at the time was beset by internal disputes and weakness, presenting what Napoleon perceived as an opportunity to secure the Iberian Peninsula more firmly within his empire and ensure strict adherence to the Continental System. Through a series of subtle manoeuvres and outright pressure, Napoleon orchestrated the abdication of the Spanish Bourbons and placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne in 1808. This act, however, was a profound miscalculation. The Spanish people, deeply conservative, Catholic and fiercely independent, viewed the imposition of a foreign king as a grave insult and an illegitimate usurpation. On May 2nd, 1808, a widespread popular uprising erupted in Madrid, brutally suppressed by French forces under Marshal Murat. Yet this 2 de Mayo uprising ignited a spark of resistance across the entire country. The Spanish people, rather than accepting Joseph as their king, rose up in a spontaneous, decentralized, and often brutal struggle against the French occupation. This was not a conventional war fought by armies on open battlefields alone. Instead, it was characterized by a new form of irregular warfare, the guerrilla. Small mobile bands of Spanish fighters, often peasants and local militias, launched ambushes, sabotaged French supply lines, and melted back into the countryside, making it incredibly difficult for the French to maintain control. The Peninsular War thus became a draining quagmire for France, tying up hundreds of thousands of Napoleon's veteran troops and consuming vast resources over the next 6 years. It was a wound that would bleed the French Empire continuously, diverting crucial attention and manpower from other theatres and marking a significant turning point in Napoleon's fortunes. The Peninsular War quickly descended into a conflict of unprecedented brutality, a stark contrast to the set-piece battles Napoleon's Grande Armée was accustomed to fighting. Indeed, the Spanish guerrillas, a term meaning little war, perfected tactics of harassment and ambush. They emerged from the mountainous terrain and dense forest to strike at isolated French detachments, supply convoys and communication lines, before vanishing as swiftly as they appeared. This constant, unpredictable threat created an environment of perpetual fear and exhaustion for the French soldiers, eroding morale and forcing them to commit vast numbers of troops to garrison duties and convoy protection, rather than decisive engagements. The French response to this widespread resistance was often equally brutal, leading to cycles of reprisals and counter-reprisals. Villages suspected of aiding guerrillas were often burned, and captured irregulars faced summary execution. This harshness, however, only served to further galvanize Spanish resolve, deepening the hatred for the foreign occupiers and fueling the insurgency. The war was characterized by a lack of mercy on both sides, transforming the Iberian Peninsula into a landscape of suffering and destruction. Adding another layer of complexity to this already brutal conflict was the direct intervention of Great Britain, seeing an opportunity to open a second front against Napoleon on the continent. The British dispatched an expeditionary force to Portugal. Under the command of Sir Arthur Wellesley, who would later become the Duke of Wellington, the British and their Portuguese allies provided a professional, disciplined army that could challenge the French in conventional battles, while also supporting the Spanish irregulars. Wellington's campaigns in the peninsula were marked by cautious strategy, effective defence, and a keen understanding of the terrain, slowly but steadily pushing back the French presence. The Peninsular War became an open wound for the French Empire. It was a constant drain on manpower, diverting seasoned veterans and fresh recruits alike from Napoleon's main campaigns in Central Europe. The financial cost was immense, and the psychological toll on the French army was profound. It was a war without end in sight, a conflict that vividly demonstrated the limits of conventional military power against a determined and unified popular resistance, especially when supported by a resilient external power. The matter of succession weighed heavily upon Napoleon. Despite his deep affection for Josephine, their union had not produced an heir, and a son who could secure the continuity of his newly established imperial dynasty. As years passed and the hope of Josephine conceiving diminished, the pragmatic necessity of a new marriage became increasingly undeniable for the emperor. This was a decision not taken lightly, for his bond with Josephine was profound and enduring, a relationship that had weathered the tumultuous years of the Revolution and the early rise to power. In December of 1809, after much deliberation and with a palpable sense of sorrow, Napoleon formally divorced Josephine. The emotional cost of this separation was significant for both of them. It was a private tragedy played out on the public stage of imperial necessity, a testament to the relentless demands placed upon a monarch to ensure the stability and future of his realm. The annulment was granted on grounds that the religious ceremony had not been properly witnessed, allowing Napoleon to seek a new wife. His gaze soon turned towards the established royal houses of Europe. A marriage with a princess from a prominent dynasty would not only provide a potential heir but also serve as a powerful diplomatic tool, forging a crucial alliance in the ever-shifting landscape of European power. After considering several options, including a Russian Grand Duchess, Napoleon ultimately settled upon Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, the daughter of Emperor Francis I. The union with Marie-Louise was arranged swiftly. For Austria, a nation repeatedly humbled by Napoleon's military might, this marriage represented a chance for peace and a potential restoration of influence. For Napoleon, it was a profound step towards legitimizing his rule in the eyes of the old European monarchies, and most crucially, fulfilling his dynastic ambitions. The marriage took place by proxy in Vienna in March 1810, followed by a grand religious ceremony in Paris. Marie-Louise, a young woman of 19, became Empress of the French. Though the marriage was one of political calculation, Napoleon treated his new empress with kindness and respect. The expectation of an heir, a direct successor to the imperial throne, now rested firmly upon this new union, shaping the future trajectory of the Napoleonic dynasty, and, by extension, the fate of Europe itself. The hopes of an empire, and indeed of Napoleon himself, rested upon the outcome of his new marriage. The primary purpose of his union with Marie-Louise was to secure the succession, to provide a legitimate heir who would solidify the future of the Bonaparte dynasty and ensure its place among the established monarchies of Europe. In the early months of 1811, anticipation grew throughout France. On March 20th, 1811, the long-awaited moment arrived. Marie-Louise gave birth to a son. The joyous news was met with widespread celebration across the empire. The birth was announced with a cannon salute, the number of shots indicating the gender of the child. When the cannon fired the 21st shot signifying a boy, the crowds in Paris erupted in cheers. Napoleon named his son Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles and bestowed upon him the title King of Rome. This designation, reminiscent of the Holy Roman Empire, underscored his ambition to create a new imperial lineage that rivaled the ancient houses of Europe. For Napoleon, the birth of his son was the ultimate fulfillment of his dynastic dreams, a tangible symbol of his power and the future he envisioned for his empire. At this juncture, Napoleon's influence seemed to reach its zenith. He was not only the master of a vast continental empire, but he now possessed a direct male heir, a living guarantee of succession. The alliance with Austria, cemented by this marriage, and the birth of a grandson to Emperor Francis I, appeared to further stabilize his position. France, under his command, stood as the dominant power in Europe, with client states and allied nations stretching across the continent. The future, for a brief and shining moment, seemed secure, and the emperor's personal and political ambitions appeared to align perfectly. This period marked an apparent peak, a moment when the dream of a lasting Napoleonic order seemed within grasp. Despite the seeming tranquility brought by the birth of his heir and the Austrian alliance, tensions were steadily mounting on Napoleon's eastern flank. The relationship between France and Russia, once seemingly solidified by the Treaty of Tilsit, had progressively deteriorated. Tsar Alexander I grew increasingly resentful of Napoleon's dominant influence in Europe and the profound economic hardships inflicted upon Russia by the continental system. The forced adherence to this embargo meant that Russia could not trade with Britain, its traditional and most profitable partner, leading to significant financial strain and discontent among the Russian nobility. Furthermore, Napoleon's annexation of the Duchy of Oldenburg, whose duke was Alexander's brother-in-law, Aras was seen as a direct affront. The creation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a French-controlled entity on Russia's western border, also fueled Russian fears of a revived Polish state and a direct threat to their own territories. Both empires began to view each other with growing suspicion and hostility, discreetly preparing for a potential confrontation. By late 1811 and early 1812, diplomacy had failed, and war seemed inevitable. Napoleon, accustomed to decisive military solutions, resolved to force Russia back into compliance with the continental system and to reassert his authority over the continent. He envisioned a swift, crushing blow that would compel Alexander to yield. To achieve this, he began to assemble an unprecedented military force. From across his vast empire and allied states, soldiers were summoned. French, German, Italian, so Polish, and other contingents converged, forming what would become known as the Grande Armée, a colossal fighting machine numbering over 600,000 men. This immense army, the largest ever seen in Europe up to that point, represented the full might of Napoleon's imperial power, poised to march eastward into the vast plains of Russia. In the quiet pre-dawn hours of June 24th, 1812, the immense Grande Armée began its crossing of the river Niemen, marking the formal commencement of the Russian campaign. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers stretching for miles streamed across pontoon bridges into the vast, unfamiliar landscape of the Russian Empire. It was a spectacle of unparalleled scale, a testament to Napoleon's organizational genius and the sheer manpower he could command. The sheer diversity of the forces was striking, like a mosaic of European nations marching under the imperial eagle. The initial advance was slow and arduous, not due to enemy resistance, but to the sheer logistical challenge of moving such a massive force. The Russian countryside, with its sparse settlements and rudimentary roads, offered little in the way of immediate sustenance for an army of this size. Napoleon's strategy relied on rapid movement and living off the land, a tactic that had served him well in the more densely populated and agriculturally rich regions of Western Europe. However, Russia was different. The distances were immense, the land often barren, and the population sparse. Supply lines, already stretched thin, quickly became a critical vulnerability. Wagons laden with provisions struggled over poor roads, often falling behind the marching columns. Fresh water became a precious commodity, and the summer heat, initially a blessing for campaigning, soon turned into a relentless adversary. Diseases, particularly dysentery and typhus, began to decimate the ranks even before the first major engagements with the Russian army. Thousands of horses, crucial for cavalry and artillery, perished from exhaustion and lack of fodder. The Russian strategy, under the command of General Barclay de Tolly, was one of continuous calculated retreat. They avoided direct pitched battles, drawing the Grande Armée deeper and deeper into the vastness of their territory. This scorched earth tactic, where anything of value was destroyed or carried away before the French arrival, further exacerbated the supply crisis. With each passing day, the Grande Armée stretched further from its bases, while its strength slowly ebbing away, not from the clash of arms, but from the relentless attrition of the march itself. The endless horizon of the Russian steppes seemed to swallow men and material, creating a profound sense of isolation and growing weariness among the invading forces. After weeks of relentless marching and skirmishes, the Grande Armée finally faced the main Russian forces under General Kutuzov at Borodino, approximately 70 miles west of Moscow. On September 7th, 1812, one of the bloodiest single-day battles in human history unfolded. From the earliest hours of dawn until nightfall, the two colossal armies engaged in a brutal point-blank struggle across a series of redoubts and earthworks. Artillery barrages tore through the ranks, and hand-to-hand combat raged with desperate ferocity. Napoleon, seeking a decisive victory to force Tsar Alexander I to terms, committed his forces with customary determination. The French captured the key positions, but at a horrifying cost. The battlefield was a scene of immense carnage, with estimates of casualties ranging from 70,000 to 90,000 men on both sides. While the French technically held the field at the end of the day, the Russian army, though badly mauled, was not destroyed. They retreated in good order, preserving their cohesion, while the Grande Armée, though victorious, was severely weakened, its fighting spirit diminished by the sheer scale of the losses. It was a victory that felt hollow, a Pyrrhic triumph that offered no clear path to peace. A week later, on September 14th, Napoleon and his advance guard entered Moscow, expecting to find a city ready to surrender, or at least to offer comfortable winter quarters. Instead, they found a largely deserted metropolis. The vast majority of its inhabitants had evacuated, taking with them anything of value. Hopes of finding ample provisions and shelter quickly evaporated. Then, a new horror unfolded. Within days of the French occupation, fires began to erupt across the city. Whether by deliberate Russian design to deny the invaders resources, or by accident, the flames spread with terrifying speed. Fueled by dry wooden buildings and fanned by strong winds, the conflagration raged for days, consuming an estimated 3/4 of Moscow. Napoleon watched from a safe distance as the ancient capital burned, its spires and domes collapsing into a sea of fire. The grand prize of Moscow, so dearly bought, had become a smouldering ruin, offering no solace, no supplies, and no strategic advantage. The dream of wintering comfortably in the Russian capital was utterly consumed by the inferno. With Moscow in ashes and winter fast approaching, Napoleon made the difficult decision to begin the retreat on October 19, 1812. His initial hope was to march south to find unplundered territories, but Russian resistance forced the Grande Armée back onto the devastated Smolensk road, the same route they had taken during the advance. This decision sealed their fate. What followed was one of the most catastrophic military retreats in history. The Russian winter descended with unprecedented ferocity. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing, bringing blizzards and icy winds. The soldiers, already weakened by hunger and disease, were ill-equipped for such extreme conditions. Their summer uniforms offered little protection against the biting cold, and supplies of food and fodder quickly dwindled. Horses, crucial for transport and cavalry, died by the thousands, their carcasses littering the frozen landscape. Starvation became a constant companion, forcing soldiers to resort to desperate measures for sustenance. Disease, particularly typhus, spread unchecked through the exhausted and malnourished ranks, claiming more lives than battle. Adding to these immense natural hardships was the relentless harassment from Cossack cavalry. These swift and elusive horsemen continuously attacked the flanks and rear of the French column, picking off stragglers, destroying what few supplies remained, and further demoralizing the already suffering troops. The Grande Armée, once a vibrant force of hundreds of thousands, disintegrated into a desperate, disorganized mass. Discipline fractured, and the cohesion of regiments dissolved. Men froze to death in their sleep, collapsed from exhaustion, or were captured by the pursuing Russians. The once proud eagles of the empire were often abandoned or buried to prevent their capture. By the time the remnants of the army reached the Berezina River in late November, they numbered only tens of thousands, a mere fraction of the original invasion force. The crossing of the Berezina, under constant attack and amidst chaos, became another desperate struggle for survival. The retreat from Moscow was not merely a military setback. It was an annihilation, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable human suffering and the utter collapse of Napoleon's formidable Grande Armée. The profound devastation of the Grande Armée in Russia sent ripples of hope and renewed defiance across the European continent. For years, Napoleon's military genius had seemed invincible, and his empire had cast a long shadow over the continent. But the sight of his shattered forces barely clinging to life as they straggled back across the frozen plains shattered the myth of his invincibility. The catastrophic losses in Russia, estimated at over 500,000 men, signalled a critical weakening of French power and presented an unprecedented opportunity for those who yearned to throw off the Napoleonic yoke. Prussia, long chafing under French domination and forced to provide troops for the Russian campaign, was the first major power to openly break with Napoleon. Under the leadership of King Frederick William III, and spurred by the growing nationalist sentiment among its people, Prussia signed the Treaty of Kalisz with Russia in February 1813. This alliance formally committed both nations to drive Napoleon out of Germany. The Prussian army, having undergone significant reforms after its humiliating defeat at Jena, began to mobilise with a renewed sense of purpose. Great Britain, Napoleon's most persistent and implacable foe, had always sought to form coalitions against him. With the Russian disaster, their diplomatic efforts intensified, and their financial support became crucial. British subsidies flowed to the continental powers, enabling them to raise and equip armies. The most significant shift came with Austria. Though Napoleon's father-in-law, Emperor Francis I, had provided an auxiliary corps for the Russian campaign, Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich skillfully navigated a complex diplomatic path. Initially offering to mediate, Austria soon saw the strategic advantage in joining the growing tide against France. They formally declared war on Napoleon in August 1813. Thus the Sixth Coalition was forged, uniting the formidable military might of Russia, the reinvigorated forces of Prussia, the strategic weight of Austria, and the enduring naval and financial power of Great Britain. This alliance represented the most formidable challenge Napoleon had yet faced, a unified front determined to dismantle his empire and restore the old order of Europe. The stage was set for a final, decisive confrontation. Following the formation of the Sixth Coalition, Napoleon, despite his depleted resources, managed to raise a new army that was largely composed of young, inexperienced conscripts. He achieved some initial tactical victories in the spring of 1813, but these could not stem the gathering tide. The Allied forces, now unified under a common purpose, steadily advanced, their numbers swelling with each passing week. The stage was set for a monumental confrontation near the city of Leipzig, in Saxony. From the 16th to the 19th of October, 1813, the Battle of Leipzig unfolded, a colossal engagement that would become known as the Battle of the Nations. It was, at that time, the largest battle in European history, a sprawling conflict involving over 500,000 soldiers. Napoleon commanded a force of around 190,000 men, a mix of French, Polish, Italian and German troops from the Confederation of the Rhine. Arrayed against him were the combined armies of the Sixth Coalition, numbering approximately 380,000 men, drawn from Russia, Prussia, Austria and Sweden. The battle raged over several days, characterized by intense fighting across a wide front around Leipzig. Artillery barrages were constant and cavalry charges swept across the fields. Initially, Napoleon managed to hold his ground, skillfully deploying his forces to counter the Allied assaults. However, the sheer numerical superiority of the coalition forces began to tell. Wave after wave of Allied attacks pressed against the French lines, slowly but inexorably pushing them back. On the third day, the situation became critical for Napoleon. Crucially, Saxon troops fighting for the French defected to the Allied side, further weakening his position, as, with his ammunition dwindling and his lines stretched to their breaking point, Napoleon was forced to order a retreat. The withdrawal was chaotic and costly. A bridge over the Ulster River, essential for the French escape, was prematurely destroyed, trapping thousands of soldiers who were then captured or drowned. The Battle of Leipzig resulted in a decisive and devastating defeat for Napoleon. His army suffered immense casualties, losing an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The coalition, though also sustaining heavy losses, had achieved a monumental victory. This battle shattered French control over Germany and effectively ended Napoleon's dominance in Central Europe. It was a turning point, signalling the beginning of the final phase of his remarkable, yet ultimately unsustainable imperial ambitions. With the devastating defeat at Leipzig, the path to France lay open. The Allied armies, emboldened by their victory and determined to end Napoleon's reign, began their invasion in earnest at the close of 1813 and into early 1814. This marked a profound shift in the conflict, as the fighting moved from the distant battlefields of Europe to the very heart of the French Empire. Napoleon, though facing overwhelming odds, prepared for a final desperate defence of his homeland. His forces were severely depleted, comprising mainly young, hastily trained conscripts, known as Marie-Louises, alongside a corps of veteran guardsmen. Against him marched the vast armies of the Sixth Coalition, numbering hundreds of thousands, pressing in from multiple directions. The Russians, Prussians, and Austrians advanced across the Rhine, while British and Spanish forces under Wellington pushed up from the south through the Pyrenees. What followed was a campaign that, despite its ultimate futility, showcased some of Napoleon's most brilliant military manoeuvres. Fighting on familiar ground, with a deep understanding of the terrain, he launched a series of swift, concentrated attacks against isolated Allied columns. This period, often referred to as the 6 Days Campaign, saw Napoleon achieve remarkable victories against superior numbers. At Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry and Vauchamp, he inflicted sharp defeats on portions of the Allied armies, demonstrating his enduring tactical genius and ability to inspire his troops. These brilliant defensive actions, however, could not change the strategic reality. Each time Napoleon struck one Allied army, another would advance elsewhere. The coalition's numerical advantage was simply too great, their resources too vast. While Napoleon won individual battles, he could not win the war. His victories were localized and temporary, unable to halt the relentless forward momentum of the combined Allied forces. As the campaign wore on, the Allies continued their relentless advance towards Paris. Despite Napoleon's personal courage and strategic brilliance, the sheer weight of numbers and the exhaustion of his dwindling forces made his position increasingly untenable. The defence of France, fought with such tenacity on its own soil, was a testament to Napoleon's unyielding spirit. Yet it was a struggle against an inevitable tide. The capital itself now lay exposed, and the future of the empire hung precariously in the balance. As the Allied armies closed in on Paris, and with his marshals reluctant to continue a seemingly hopeless struggle, the pressure on Napoleon became immense. On March 31st, 1814, the coalition forces entered the French capital. With Paris occupied and his last-ditch efforts to rally support failing, Napoleon was confronted with the stark reality of his situation. At Fontainebleau, his headquarters south of Paris, Napoleon attempted to abdicate in favour of his son, Napoleon II, with Marie-Louise acting as regent. However, the Allied powers, wary of any continuation of the Bonaparte dynasty, rejected this proposal, They demanded an unconditional abdication. Facing betrayal from some of his closest marshals and with no viable military option left, Napoleon ultimately yielded. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte formally abdicated the imperial throne of France. The Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed 5 days later, formalised his surrender. In exchange for renouncing his claims to power, he was granted sovereignty over the small island of Elba, located off the coast of Tuscany, and allowed to retain the title of emperor along with an annual income. The scene of his farewell to the imperial guard at Fontainebleau, known as the Farewell of Fontainebleau, was a sombre and poignant moment. He addressed his devoted soldiers, expressing his sorrow at leaving them and wishing them well. It was a powerful display of the bond he shared with his troops, even in defeat. On April 20th, 1814, Napoleon departed for Elba. The journey was not without incident, as he encountered hostile crowds in royalist areas of southern France, necessitating disguises and a swift passage. Upon his arrival on May 4th, Elba offered a quiet, picturesque setting for his exile. For a time it seemed as though the tumultuous reign of Napoleon had finally come to an end. He dedicated himself to governing his miniature empire, overseeing improvements to infrastructure, agriculture, and the small Elban army. He reflected on his past campaigns, reorganized his small court, and engaged in intellectual pursuits. The world believed that Napoleon, the once unstoppable force, was now merely the ruler of a tiny island, his ambitions contained, his future seemingly sealed within its quiet shores. Yet, beneath this veneer of peaceful administration, the restless mind of the emperor was undoubtedly at work, observing, calculating, and perhaps dreaming of a return. With Napoleon's departure for Elba, the Allied powers and the French Senate moved swiftly to establish a new government. The path chosen was the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, a dynasty that had been overthrown during the French Revolution more than 2 decades earlier. Louis Stanislas Xavier, the brother of the executed Louis XVI, was recalled from exile and proclaimed King Louis XVIII of France. Louis XVIII, a stout and elderly man, returned to a nation profoundly changed by revolution and empire. He attempted to navigate the complex political landscape by granting a constitutional charter which preserved many of the reforms introduced by Napoleon, including the Napoleonic Code and the principle of equality before the law. However, despite these concessions, the new regime quickly began to alienate various segments of French society. The returning émigrés, many of whom had fled France during the Revolution, sought to reclaim their confiscated lands and privileges, causing deep resentment among those who had acquired property during the intervening years. The army, once fiercely loyal to Napoleon, felt marginalized and insulted by the new leadership. Many officers were replaced by royalist aristocrats, and the proud traditions of the imperial guard were diminished. The tricolour flag, a symbol of revolutionary and imperial France, was replaced by the white flag of the Bourbons, a change that felt like a step backward for many. Economically, the country was weary from years of war, and the restoration did little to immediately alleviate the burdens on the common people. Taxation remained a significant issue, and the promise of a peaceful transition often felt hollow amidst lingering anxieties. The perceived inefficiencies and a certain air of aristocratic disdain from the new government leaders further fueled public dissatisfaction. Beneath the surface of a restored monarchy, a quiet discontent began to simmer. The memory of Napoleon, his glory, and the stability he had brought, even if through authoritarian means, remained potent. For many, the Bourbon Restoration seemed to represent a regression, an attempt to erase the transformative years of the Revolution and Empire, rather than building upon them. This growing dissatisfaction often unspoken but deeply felt, created fertile ground for future upheaval, unbeknownst to many, even as Napoleon quietly observed from his distant island. From his small island domain of Elba, Napoleon closely observed the growing unrest within France. The news of the Bourbon monarchy's unpopularity, the alienation of the army, and the general dissatisfaction among the populace reached him consistently. He recognized an opportunity, a final audacious chance to reclaim his destiny. On February 26, 1815, under the cover of darkness, Napoleon slipped away from Elba with a small contingent of about 1,000 men. He embarked on a brig, the Inconstant, and sailed stealthily towards the French coast. On March 1st he landed near Cannes, proclaiming his return to the French people. What followed was a remarkable and largely bloodless march to Paris. As Napoleon advanced northward, the troops sent by Louis XVIII to arrest him instead defected to his side. Marshal Ney, who had famously promised Louis XVIII that he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, found himself unable to resist the emperor's charisma and joined his former commander. The sight of Napoleon, the legend, once more among them, ignited a fervent loyalty in the hearts of many soldiers and citizens. The journey became a triumphal procession. Crowds gathered cheering his name, and town after town welcomed him with open arms. It was a testament to his enduring popularity and the deep-seated resentment against the restored Bourbons. Louis XVIII, realizing the futility of resistance, fled Paris on March 19th. The very next day, March 20th, Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace, the seat of French power, without a single shot being fired. He had regained his throne. This extraordinary period, from his landing in France to the final defeat at Waterloo, became known as the 100 Days. It was Napoleon's last desperate gamble, a testament to his indomitable will and his unwavering belief in his own star. He sought to re-establish his empire, hoping to convince the European powers that his return would bring stability, but they saw only a renewed threat to peace. The stage was set for a final, decisive confrontation. The European powers, seeing Napoleon's return not as a legitimate restoration, but as a direct challenge to the fragile peace, immediately formed the Seventh Coalition. Their objective was clear: to decisively defeat Napoleon and permanently remove him from power. Knowing that time was against him, Napoleon decided to strike preemptively, aiming to defeat the Allied armies in Belgium before they could fully unite. On June 18, 1815, near the village of Waterloo in present-day Belgium, Napoleon's army met the forces of the Duke of Wellington, composed primarily of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops. A crucial element of the Allied strategy was the expected arrival of Prussian forces under Marshal Blucher, who had been defeated by Napoleon 2 days prior at Ligny but was determined to join Wellington. The battle commenced with Napoleon's characteristic aggressive assaults. French artillery pounded Wellington's defensive positions, particularly the strongholds of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte. Wave after wave of French infantry and cavalry launched fierce attacks against the Allied lines, which held firm, forming squares to repel the charges of the famed French cuirassiers and lancers. The fighting was intense and protracted, as marked by immense courage and heavy casualties on both sides. Throughout the long day, Wellington's forces endured relentless pressure, their resolve tested to its limits. The arrival of Blucher's Prussian corps in the late afternoon proved to be the pivotal turning point. Their appearance on Napoleon's right flank stretched the French lines and introduced a new, formidable threat. In a desperate final effort, Napoleon committed his elite Imperial Guard, a force previously considered invincible, to break Wellington's centre. However, even these legendary veterans, advancing uphill, under a hail of cannon fire and musket volleys, were ultimately repelled. The sight of the Imperial Guard retreating shattered French morale. With the Prussians pressing hard and Wellington's line finally advancing, the French army disintegrated into a chaotic rout. The Battle of Waterloo was a crushing and irreversible defeat for Napoleon. It marked the end of his military career, his political ambitions, and indeed, his active life as a ruler. The sun set on June 18th, 1815, on a field of unimaginable carnage, and with it, the era of Napoleon Bonaparte as a dominant force in Europe drew to its ultimate close. Following the catastrophic defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon returned to Paris, his hopes of maintaining power utterly shattered. The political landscape had shifted dramatically. His allies had vanished, and the legislative chambers, emboldened by the news from the battlefield, were no longer willing to support him. Faced with overwhelming pressure and to prevent further bloodshed in the streets of Paris, Napoleon abdicated for a second time on June 22, 1815. This act marked the definitive end of his second reign, famously known as the 100 Days. With the Allied armies once again converging on the French capital, Napoleon realised his position in France was untenable. He sought to escape capture and, in a move that seemed to reflect a lingering sense of his own importance, considered seeking asylum. His thoughts turned to America, a distant land where he imagined he might live out his days in peace. However, escape across the Atlantic was fraught with peril, with British warships patrolling the coasts. Instead, Napoleon made a fateful decision. He travelled to Rochefort, a port city on the west coast of France, with the intention of surrendering to the British. On July 15th, 1815, he boarded HMS Bellerophon, a British warship, believing that by placing himself in the hands of the British government, he would be treated with the courtesy due to a former head of state. He envisioned a quiet, dignified exile in England, perhaps as a country gentleman. Napoleon formally delivered a letter to the Prince Regent, appealing for protection and hospitality, likening himself to Themistocles seeking refuge in Persia. He had hoped for an honourable reception, a recognition of his stature, even in defeat. However, the British government, along with its European allies, held a very different view of the deposed emperor. They saw him not as a statesman deserving of lenient treatment, but as an incorrigible disturber of the peace, a perpetual threat to European stability. His hopes for a gentleman's exile in England would not be realised. A far more isolated and desolate fate awaited him. The British government, along with its European allies, determined that Napoleon's continued presence on the European continent, or even in a reachable location like England, posed an unacceptable risk. His capacity to inspire loyalty and reignite conflict was considered too great. A place of ultimate isolation was sought, a distant prison from which escape would be virtually impossible. Their choice fell upon the remote island of St. Helena. St. Helena lay deep in the South Atlantic Ocean, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest mainland. It was a small, volcanic outpost, windswept and rugged, characterized by steep cliffs and an often misty, humid climate. The journey there, aboard HMS Northumberland, was long and arduous, a stark contrast to the swift movements of his campaigns. Then for Napoleon, it was a voyage into an unknown and confined future, far removed from the grandeur of his past. Upon arrival in October 1815, Napoleon and his small retinue were initially housed in a modest residence before being moved to Longwood House. This estate, while possessing some space, was situated on a particularly exposed and often damp part of the island. The conditions were far from the imperial palaces he had once commanded. The house itself was in a state of disrepair, prone to draughts and moisture, and was frequently shrouded in mist, contributing to a sense of perpetual gloom. His days on St. Helena were marked by a profound sense of confinement. A perimeter was established around Longwood House, heavily guarded by British soldiers, restricting his movements to a small, isolated area, where British warships constantly patrolled the surrounding waters, ensuring no vessel could approach or depart without scrutiny. The isolation was absolute, a deliberate strategy to ensure that the once mighty emperor could never again threaten the peace of Europe. The harsh realities of this distant exile began to slowly erode his spirit, marking the final, protracted chapter of his extraordinary life. Life on St. Helena settled into a slow, monotonous rhythm for Napoleon. Stripped of his imperial authority and the vast armies he once commanded, his existence became one of quiet, confined routine. His days were largely spent within the damp confines of Longwood House, or on brief, supervised excursions within the restricted perimeter. The once tireless general now found himself with an abundance of time and a limited scope for activity. His interactions with his British captors were often strained. Sir Hudson Lowe, the island's governor, was a stern and meticulous man, tasked with the unenviable duty of securing the most dangerous man in Europe. His vigilance, at times perceived as petty interference, frequently clashed with Napoleon's proud and unyielding temperament. Disputes arose over trivial matters, from the quality of the wine provided to the extent of his permitted movements, each interaction a reminder of his diminished status. Despite the frustrations and the pervasive sense of ennui, Napoleon dedicated a significant portion of his time to dictating his memoirs. Surrounded by his loyal companions, he recounted his campaigns, his political decisions, and his vision for France and Europe. These dictations were an attempt to shape his own narrative, used to justify his actions, and to secure his legacy for posterity, free from the interpretations of his enemies. He meticulously detailed battles, analysed strategies, and reflected on the grand sweep of history, all from the quiet isolation of his remote prison. He also engaged in reading, studied gardening, and occasionally played cards or billiards with his companions. Yet, beneath these surface activities, a profound melancholy often lingered. He reflected on the transient nature of power, the fickleness of fortune, and the ultimate isolation of leadership. The vastness of his ambition had led him to this tiny, distant speck in the ocean, a poignant end to a life that had once shaken the foundations of an entire continent. His final years were a testament to endurance, yet a quiet struggle against the relentless grip of captivity and the slow march of time. As the years slowly passed on St. Helena, Napoleon's health began to steadily decline. The damp climate, the lack of stimulating activity, and perhaps the lingering effects of earlier campaigns all contributed to his weakening constitution. He suffered from chronic stomach pain and a general malaise that grew progressively worse. The once robust figure, capable of enduring immense physical hardship, was now a shadow of his former self, increasingly frail and confined to his bed. His final days were marked by a quiet resignation. Surrounded by his few loyal companions, he spoke less of empire and more of personal matters, of his family, and of the peaceful countryside of his youth. The grand ambitions that had once consumed him seemed to recede, replaced by a yearning for tranquility. On the evening of May 5th, 1821, as a fierce storm raged outside Longwood House, Napoleon Bonaparte passed away at the age of 51. The precise cause of his death has been a subject of much historical debate. The official British autopsy cited stomach cancer as the primary cause, a diagnosis consistent with his symptoms and family history. However, later analyses of his hair samples revealed elevated levels of arsenic, leading to theories of deliberate poisoning. Yet, other scholars contend that the arsenic could have been administered for medicinal purposes, or even absorbed from environmental sources on the island. Regardless of the exact medical explanation, His passing marked the end of an extraordinary life, far from the battlefields and palaces where he had once held sway. His death on that remote island, under the watchful eyes of his former enemies, was devoid of the grand spectacle that had characterized so much of his life. It was a subdued and solitary end for a man who had once commanded millions and reshaped the map of Europe. For nearly 2 decades after his death, Napoleon's remains rested beneath a simple slab on St. Helena, far from the land he had once ruled. Yet in France, his legend only grew. The years following his final exile were marked by political instability and a longing for the glories of the past. The memory of Napoleon, once a figure of fear to European monarchies, began to transform into that of a national hero, a symbol of French power and ambition. This growing sentiment culminated in 1840, when King Louis-Philippe, yet seeking to bolster his own legitimacy and appeal to popular sentiment, made the momentous decision to repatriate Napoleon's body to France. This was not merely a logistical undertaking. It was conceived as a grand national spectacle, designed to rekindle the spirit of a bygone era. A French delegation, aboard the frigate Belle Poule, sailed to St. Helena to retrieve the emperor's coffin. The journey back to France was a triumphant procession. When the ship arrived in Cherbourg, the coffin was transferred to a specially constructed funeral barge, which slowly navigated the Seine River towards Paris. Along the entire route, vast crowds gathered, braving the cold December weather to witness this extraordinary event. The banks of the river were lined with silent, respectful onlookers, and many overcome with emotion at the sight of the barge carrying their emperor home. The culmination of this solemn journey was Napoleon's reburial at Les Invalides, a magnificent complex originally built as a home and hospital for disabled soldiers, and now a military museum. On December 15th, 1840, with immense pomp and ceremony, his coffin was finally laid to rest in a crypt beneath the dome of the Dôme des Invalides, a place of honour befitting a national hero. This grand event solidified his place in the French popular imagination, transforming him from a controversial figure into an enduring symbol of French glory and national pride, a legacy that would continue to resonate through the centuries. Beyond the battlefields and the shifting political landscapes of his own time, Napoleon Bonaparte left an indelible mark on the continent of Europe, shaping its future in profound and often unforeseen ways. His campaigns, while driven by imperial ambition, inadvertently became vehicles for the dissemination of revolutionary ideals that had first ignited in France. Concepts of liberty, equality, and fraternity, though often distorted by his rule, resonated across borders, challenging entrenched aristocratic privilege and feudal structures. The very map of Europe was dramatically redrawn under Napoleon's influence. Ancient empires were dismantled, and new states, often client kingdoms or confederations, emerged. While many of these changes were reversed after his downfall, the underlying challenge to the old order had been made. The Holy Roman Empire, a millennium-old entity, was finally dissolved, paving the way for a more consolidated German identity, albeit one that would take decades to fully realise. Similarly, in Italy, the brief unification under French control planted the seeds of a future Italian nation-state. Perhaps one of the most significant, if unintended, consequences of Napoleon's rule was the rise of nationalism. His occupation of various territories and the imposition of French culture and law often provoked a strong sense of local identity and resistance. People began to see themselves not merely as subjects of a monarch, but as members of a distinct nation, sharing a common language, culture, and history. This nascent nationalism would become a dominant force in 19th and 20th century European politics, leading to both unification movements and devastating conflicts. Furthermore, Napoleon's administrative and legal reforms had a lasting modernizing effect. The Napoleonic Code, with its emphasis on legal equality, property rights, and religious toleration, was introduced across vast swathes of Europe. Even after the collapse of his empire, many of these legal principles endured, forming the foundation of modern civil law in numerous countries. His centralized administration, efficient bureaucracy, and emphasis on meritocracy also served as models, inspiring similar reforms in states seeking to strengthen their own governance. The echoes of his influence, therefore, continued to shape the continent long after the dust of his wars had settled. Within France itself, Napoleon Bonaparte's legacy is perhaps even more deeply ingrained, forming many of the foundational pillars of the modern French state. His most celebrated and enduring achievement is undoubtedly the Civil Code, often known as the Napoleonic Code. Promulgated in 1804, this comprehensive body of law codified and rationalized the disparate legal traditions of France, establishing principles such as equality before the law, protection of private property, and the secular nature of the state. It remains the bedrock of French civil law to this day and has influenced legal systems across the globe. Beyond the legal framework, Napoleon meticulously rebuilt and centralized the French administration, creating a highly efficient and hierarchical system that largely persists. He established the prefectural system, appointing prefects to govern each department, ensuring direct control from Paris and uniform application of laws and policies throughout the nation. This centralized structure, a response to the chaotic provincialism of the Ancien Regime and the Revolution, provided stability and coherence, fostering a strong sense of national unity. The educational system also bears Napoleon's imprint. Recognizing the importance of a skilled and loyal citizenry, he reformed and expanded secondary education, creating the lycées to train future administrators and military officers. While access was initially limited, these institutions laid the groundwork for a standardized meritocratic public education system designed to serve the state. He also established the University of France, overseeing all public education, further cementing state control over intellectual life. Finally, Napoleon played a pivotal role in shaping French national identity and pride. Despite his imperial ambitions and the eventual defeat, he provided France with a sense of order and glory after the tumult of the Revolution. His military triumphs, the grandeur of his court, and the enduring nature of his reforms instilled a powerful, if complex, sense of national accomplishment. He became a symbol of French power and innovation, a figure around whom a narrative of exceptionalism could be woven. Even in defeat, his image as a tragic hero, a titan who dared to challenge the old world, continued to inspire a deep sense of French pride, a sentiment powerfully demonstrated by the repatriation of his remains and the enduring fascination with his persona. As one contemplates the vast sweep of Napoleon Bonaparte's life and influence, it becomes evident that he was a figure defined by profound contradictions. He embodied both the progressive spirit of his age and the ancient impulse for absolute power. On one hand, he presented himself as a liberator, sweeping away the vestiges of feudalism and spreading the principles of equality, meritocracy, and religious toleration across Europe through his civil code. In many territories, his arrival meant the end of aristocratic privilege and the introduction of more rational governance. Yet this image of a liberator stands in stark contrast to his actions as a tyrant. He suppressed dissent, curtailed freedoms of the press and assembly, and established a vast secret police network. His rule was undeniably authoritarian, prioritizing order and state power above individual liberties. He crowned himself emperor, an act that seemed to betray the republican ideals he once championed, and demonstrating a personal ambition that often overshadowed any commitment to revolutionary principles. He was a visionary indeed, conceiving of a unified Europe under French dominance, a continent reshaped by rational laws and efficient administration. His grand projects, from the reorganization of the legal system to the construction of infrastructure, spoke to a mind capable of comprehensive and forward-thinking design. Yet, this vision was inextricably linked to his role as a warmonger. His empire was built and maintained through constant conflict, leading to millions of deaths across Europe. The relentless pursuit of expansion and the desire for ultimate supremacy fueled a continuous cycle of warfare that ultimately led to his downfall and left a continent exhausted. Napoleon was undeniably a product of the Enlightenment, deeply influenced by its emphasis on reason, science, and the secular state. He admired philosophers and sought to apply rational principles to governance. However, he also embraced a form of personal rule that harkened back to absolute monarchies, concentrating all power in his own hands and demanding unwavering loyalty. He was an individual who utilized the tools and ideas of modernity to construct an empire that, in many ways, defied the very spirit of popular sovereignty that the Enlightenment had helped to ignite. This intricate tapestry of conflicting ideals and actions ensures that the assessment of Napoleon remains a complex and endlessly debated endeavour. The influence of Napoleon Bonaparte, long after his passing, continues to ripple through the fabric of the modern world, manifesting in ways both subtle and overt. His strategic brilliance, honed on countless battlefields, remains a subject of intense study in military academies across the globe. Concepts such as the concentrated use of artillery, the rapid deployment of forces, and the principle of achieving local superiority at the decisive point continue to inform contemporary military doctrine. Commanders and strategists still analyze his campaigns, seeking to glean insights into leadership, logistics, and the psychology of warfare. Beyond the battlefield, Napoleon's impact on legal systems is perhaps one of his most enduring legacies. The Napoleonic Code, or Civil Code, with its emphasis on clarity, uniformity, and the protection of individual rights, served as a foundational model for civil law systems in numerous nations. Its principles, such as the equality of all citizens before the law, the right to property, and the secular nature of the state, were revolutionary for their time and spread far beyond the borders of France. Countries in Europe, Latin America, and even parts of Africa and Asia adopted or adapted its tenets, shaping the legal frameworks that govern millions of people today. In the realm of political thought, Napoleon's reign ignited debates about the nature of leadership, the balance between order and liberty, and the role of the state. His authoritarian tendencies sparked reactions that contributed to the development of liberal thought, emphasizing constitutionalism and individual freedoms. Conversely, his ability to mobilize national sentiment and centralize power also offered a blueprint for strong states, influencing nationalist movements and administrative reforms for generations to come. His presence in historical discourse is also unwavering. Historians, biographers, and scholars ceaselessly revisit his life, his motivations, and his impact. He remains a figure around whom passionate arguments are built, a touchstone for discussions on heroism and tyranny, progress and destruction. His image, his words, and his deeds continue to captivate the imagination, ensuring that the name Napoleon Bonaparte resonates not merely as a historical footnote, but as an active and vital force in understanding the trajectory of human civilization. As the echoes of Napoleon's life gently fade into the quiet of this moment, we're invited to simply contemplate the immense sweep of his existence. From the rugged shores of Corsica to the desolate expanse of St. Helena, his journey was one of astonishing ascent and precipitous fall. Although he moved across the stage of history with a force that altered the trajectory of nations, reshaping maps, legal codes, and the very consciousness of a continent. Consider the sheer scale of the changes he initiated. The old order, centuries in the making, crumbled under the weight of his armies and the power of his ideas. New systems emerged, often bearing his indelible mark, creating foundations that endure to this day. His ambition, a force of nature in itself, propelled him to heights rarely achieved, yet it also led to the devastating conflicts that consumed millions of lives. There is a quiet lesson in this ebb and flow, this rise and decline. It speaks to the transient nature of even the most formidable power, and the complex interplay of individual will with the currents of historical circumstance. His story is a powerful reminder that even the most monumental figures are ultimately part of a larger ongoing narrative, contributing their chapter to the endless unfolding of time. Allow your mind to drift through these reflections, acknowledging the profound impact of one man on so much, and recognizing the quiet passage of history, ever moving, ever changing. The grand tapestry of the past, with all its triumphs and tragedies, slowly settles, inviting a deeper sense of tranquility. And so our long journey through the remarkable life of Napoleon Bonaparte gently draws to a close. We have traversed continents and decades, witnessed the fervour of revolutions and the quietude of exile, all within the soothing embrace of historical narrative. From the first spark of his ambition to the final breath on a distant isle, the story has unfolded, inviting contemplation and calm. Allow the intricacies of his strategic mind, the vastness of his empire, and the lasting impact of his legacy to recede now like distant memories. The vivid tapestry of the past, woven with threads of power, reform, and conflict, now softens into a comforting blur. There is no need to hold on to any particular detail, only to let the gentle rhythm of the story guide you further into a state of profound peace. The grand sweep of history, with its monumental figures and sweeping changes, can be a tranquil companion as you prepare for rest. It reminds us of the endless flow of time, the rise and fall of empires, and the enduring human spirit that navigates these vast currents. All the battles fought, the decrees signed, the journeys undertaken, they now merge into a harmonious stillness. Feel yourself drifting softly and effortlessly, away from the complexities of the historical narrative and deeper into your own tranquility. The quiet authority of the past has served its purpose, gently guiding you towards this moment of serenity. Let your breathing become softer, slower, and more even. Release any lingering thoughts or sensations. The night is calm, and a profound rest awaits you. May your sleep be deep, undisturbed, and utterly rejuvenating. As the final echoes of Napoleon's extraordinary life fade, may you find comfort and peace in the quietude of the present moment. Sleep well.